A Cowboy for Auction, Riverdale Ranch Romance Book Number 2. Written by Jewel Allen. Narrated by Melissa Connell and Scott Rose. Chapter 1. Nellie. Without her contacts, Nellie Larkin was blind as a bat. Since developing an infection in her eye from her mascara, the doctor had told her to lay off the contacts. And of course, the last thing she wanted to do in public was to wear her unflattering glasses, even though it helped her to see. It was a shame, really, to be all blurry-eyed at Sunny Ridge's annual Cowboy charity auction. To not be able to fully appreciate the candidates on stage was sad indeed. The high school gymnasium in the small Colorado town was full to the rafters, mostly of young women who were twittering obnoxiously about this year's lineup. There were a dozen local cowboys whom one could bid on in exchange for a romantic date. The activity was up to the cowboy, and it was to remain a surprise until the day mutually agreed upon. Amidst the other female silly nonsense, Nellie knew how to play it cool. She simply stood there fanning herself with the program which had all the cowboys' stats, and which she couldn't read. In her purse, she carried a wad of cash from her savings, so she could snag herself a date. Daddy was flabbergasted that she had to resort to this. Now, why would my little cowgirl princess have to hire a date when she could have anyone she wanted? He asked. It's for a good cause, Daddy, she said, fluttering her lashes. Althea Brown and her service circle want to start a horse rehab and rehoming center. What she didn't tell him was that A, amazingly, at 26, she didn't have a steady boyfriend at the moment, and B, Graham had been pestering her. No, demanding that Nellie needed to come around with a boyfriend, and she needed a fake one to get Graham off her case. Why not use a good-looking cowboy and support a good cause at the same time? Graham, Elizabeth Larkin, terror of the Larkin household, tough as nails. What she said went. But no longer. Graham was sick and had told Nellie that if she couldn't see Nellie starting to settle down, Nellie would send her straight to her grave unhappy. Now, Graham could be exaggerating, but then again, she might not. She was 86, and though her ticker was still ticking as it should, she was pretty much bedridden. If something were to happen to Graham, the thought was too hard to bear. Graham was the only one who listened to Nellie's true joys and woes, the one whom she could spend an afternoon with, content, because she didn't believe in empty chatter. Underneath all that steel, Graham had a soft spot for Nellie. Graham was the only one who knew Nellie's deep yearning to get out of this one stoplight town and start afresh somewhere. Maybe even back east where no one knew her or who her daddy was. A commotion intruded into Nellie's thoughts. The girls near her were chattering like magpies, and now Nellie could see why. A blurry cowboy figure was coming down from the stage and heading her way. Maybe it was Jim Beecher, who played quarterback in high school, or Zach Lane, who lived down the street from Nellie, or maybe it was Cass Mull, who held the county record for fastest lumberjack. Bram Brown was up for auction too, but everyone knew he was Stella's main squeeze, and Stella had already announced she'd outbid everyone. Nellie fluffed her long, perfectly curled red hair and smiled as the cowboy approached. As he got closer and her eyes could discern details better, she realized it was Dax Ellison. Her smile turned to a scowl. He was possibly the only cowboy on Earth immune to her charms, and that bugged Nellie in a major way. No matter how much she fluttered her eyelashes at him or smiled or dropped her proverbial handkerchief, Dax remained aloof and, if she could say so, he could be rather annoying with his relentless sarcasm. Too bad his personality didn't match his saddle-making reputation. Nellie Larkin, he said in his low baritone that came from the trunk of a neck, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down. Well, well, well. I didn't know you were desperate for company this week. She folded her arms over her chest, ready for battle. I'm not shocked you'd scuff your cowboy boots just to needle me. I'm here to wish you luck, he said. So you get the cowboy of your dreams. That's why you're here, right? Nellie scoffed. I'm here to support the Sunny Ridge Service Circle, she said. He leaned closer, and now she could see, with resentment, that his brawny good looks were wasted on someone so short on manners. "Ah," he said, clutching at his heart on his broad chest in a red flannel shirt. "That is so moving. It's a good thing your daddy subsidizes your charity efforts. Dax Ellison, I will have you know I am using my own money today. Not that it's any of your concern." Surprise glinted in his eyes, and then his usual amused expression returned. "Who were you going to bid on?" he asked like he couldn't care less. "Well, definitely not you." She poked his chest. He caught her hand in his, and for a moment, neither one spoke. And it seemed neither could she breathe. My, he had muscles, and his eyes were amazingly blue when they probed hers, like the sky after rain. His large hand actually held hers gently, as though he had a caring bone in that physique. Too bad his appearance didn't match his personality. "Makes sense." He released her and then winked. "I don't think you brought enough cash to win me." And with that, he pivoted on a cowboy boot heel and returned to the stage, leaving Nellie wishing she could stick hairpins in his smart mouth. "Ooh, that Dax Ellison makes my blood boil," she muttered under her breath. "Talking to yourself?" a snarky female voice said to her left. Nellie squinted that direction. "Well, hello, Sylvia," she said. Sylvia Garcia and Nellie had never gotten on well, not since Sylvia's boyfriend Cody tried to flirt with Nellie at junior prom. It was only after Sylvia and Cody had broken up that Nellie agreed to go on a date with him. She didn't believe in cheating, but Sylvia had acted like Nellie was a homewrecker. "So," Sylvia said, "who are you angling for?" Nellie bristled. "You and the whole town's so nosy. Why are you asking? So you can try to outbid me?" Sylvia frowned, tossing her long brown hair to the side. "Just curious. No need to get testy." Nellie shrugged. "Frankly, you're going to need more money on your waitressing job to even come close to what I'm bidding." Sylvia clamped her mouth shut and huffed off. "Good. Let the girl stew. The more Nellie kept her competition guessing, the better. She wasn't about to reveal her trade secrets. The auctioneer pounded on the gavel, the sound echoing in the ancient gym. "Are we all ready?" he asked the crowd. A swell of screams rose up pathetically from among the desperate girls. Nellie stood to the side, hoping they wouldn't infect her with their neediness. He proceeded to explain the rules. "Everyone will get a chance to bid on a cowboy and a mystery romantic date. If you win a cowboy, you'll have until the end of this evening to pay for it. All the proceeds will go to Sunny Ridge Service Circle. And now, a word about our sponsors." As soon as the auctioneer was done, the girls cheered wildly. They were really an embarrassment to her gender. Nellie clutched at her bidding paddle. As Miles rattled off the first cowboy's name and began the bidding, she listened more for the sound of the girl's reaction. Lukewarm, almost giggly, like a joke. Nope, Nellie wasn't interested. The next one was better received, but still not as wild of a reception. So was the third and the fourth. Finally, they came to a cowboy who made the crowd squeal so loud that Nellie couldn't hear his name over the din. "Who will bid on this cowboy?" the auctioneer asked. Hands shot up quickly, and then a voice that floated above the rest could be heard in the gym. "Me!" It was Sylvia. She wanted this cowboy? Nellie couldn't see him in the blur of her vision, but he looked muscular and tall. Well, then Sylvia'd have to fight Nellie for him. Nellie raised her paddle. Sylvia was standing close enough to Nellie that Nellie saw her turn and give her the stink eye. The bidding continued until it had reached the $500 threshold Nellie had set for herself. Sylvia turned to her again, looking extremely annoyed. "Going once? Going twice? Dax Ellison is sold for $500 to that beautiful redhead." Oh, dear. She won who?
Chapter 2. Dax. Dax couldn't believe it. Him, going on a date with the cowgirl princess of Sunny Ridge, Nellie Larkin. Why, it almost seemed like the day hell froze over. Nellie Larkin, former homecoming queen, Miss Snoot herself. Lived in a house overlooking Sunny Ridge like it was some castle. Had a rich daddy, a ma who didn't work outside the home, and an inheritance of half of Sunny Ridge's farmland. But he also thought of high school, when he, along with most of the school's male population, was chasing after her. Full sassy red hair under that white cowgirl hat, white blouse tied midriff with a knot that accentuated her slim waist, a short skirt with those kick-em-up red boots encasing those long, long legs. His friends had warned him about Nellie. She was a heartbreaker, they said. Stay clear of her like cow pie. But he didn't listen to them. He was too caught up crushing on the girl. His infatuation with Nellie Larkin had started in his sophomore year during fifth period home economics with Mrs. Maskell. A girl and a boy were paired to go on a dinner date with each other. Just in the cafeteria with everyone else, mind you. But etiquette class was a big deal anyways. And luck of the draw, Dax got Nellie. He went to school that day nearly breaking out in hives. Nellie Larkin of all people. Surely she was going to embarrass him in front of everyone. Dax wasn't some yokel, but he wasn't used to fancy stuff like where to put the forks and how to drink soup without slurping. He took off his hat as he entered the room, his eyes zoning in on Nellie right away. She had her back turned to him with one of those frilly aprons tied around her waist. He cleared his throat and greeted her. She turned around with a cute smile and actually said, "I'm so glad you're my partner." Just like that. It was enough to make him blush like a beet. If she noticed, she didn't say anything. "Now, why would you say that?" he asked when he remembered how to speak. "I've seen you around with your ma," she said. "You carry her groceries and don't sass her. Unlike other cowboys, you don't curse or smoke behind the school." Nellie Larkin noticed those things? She gave him a sidelong glance. "Plus, you have a nice smile and kind eyes." Cupid hit his mark that day, even though he and Nellie were as night and day as far as money went. Dax's folks, while they were still alive, were good, hard-working people, but they didn't own much. So when Valentine's Day dance their senior year was announced, Dax made an invitation on a piece of barnwood with a bow of baling twine and the words, "Will you be my Valentine?" and took it to Nellie's porch. When she accepted by putting a pair of scissors on his porch with the message, "You're cutting it close, cowboy, but my answer is yes," he was over the moon. Until she told him, through a note, that she changed her mind. The football captain had asked her, and well, sorry, but she accepted his invitation instead. Boy, was Dax crushed. Especially since Noah, the football captain, cursed and smoked, not to mention his smile was fake. Ever since, Dax hadn't paid her any mind, except when he saw her around town to tease and to make her life miserable, as he imagined her saying it. But now, this. She'd bid and won him at auction. Whoa. It was enough to make a cowboy say, "Yee-haw." Well, well. It could be an opportunity to teach a cowgirl heartbreaker a lesson. Nellie was marching up to the stage. The lady must be really eager for their date. Be still his heart. "This is a mistake," Nellie hissed to the auctioneer, Miles Graves. "I didn't mean to bid on him." She gave Dax a pointed glance. Shucks. Did she have to be so complimentary? He should have known it was a mistake. Like the Valentine dance. Nellie was always trying to get out of her obligations to Dax. Miles stroked his handlebar mustache. "I can't blame you, Nellie. I wouldn't either, knowing what a mule Dax can be. But you're locked in. Sorry. It's not fair to the rest of the bidders that you'd pull out like this. The money's already committed." "But it just happened." Nellie folded her arms across her chest. "Surely we can just do it over." "What seems to be the problem here?" Sunny Ridge Service Circle's chair, Althea Brown, Bram's mom, came up to the huddled bunch. Were those tears in Nellie's eyes? "Oh, Althea," she said, "I was just telling Miles that I made a mistake and bid on the wrong cowboy." "Didn't you win Dax Ellison?" Althea cast a dark-eyed glance at him. Nellie scowled. "Well, Yes, but I didn't mean to. I don't have my glasses on, so I couldn't see who was up for bidding. Althea rubbed her chin in deep thought and studied Nellie over her reading glasses. Well, the way I see it, you can get out of it. Nellie brightened. By paying double the amount. What? Nellie sputtered. She cast a derisive glance at Dax. He's not worth $1,000. He's not even worth a quarter of that. Ouch. Do I hear an eighth? Dax piped up, but she ignored him. You can always give your date away to Sylvia, Miles said. I believe you and she were going hot and heavy, outbidding each other for Dax. Nellie's cheeks reddened. Glaring at Miles, at Althea, and then at Dax, she looked gloriously beautiful with that fiery red hair and green eyes, and majorly ticked off. As she huffed away, Miles shook his head. That one's trouble. He glanced at Dax. Best of luck to you. Thanks, Dax said. I'm gonna need it. Chapter 3. Dax. Luck? He needed more than luck. Dax could use a wrangler. He pulled up in his beat-up brown Chevy at Nellie's place. At least she was civil enough about letting him approach and tell her after the auction that he could pick her up for their date Saturday morning if she was interested. Do I have a choice? She had asked. Now, if Dax were a long-suffering kind of cowboy, he'd have put up with her sassy mouth and just tipped his hat. But he'd changed since high school a bit. No longer was he the scaredy-cat wimp he used to be. There was only so much time in the world, and he didn't believe in beating around the bush. So he told Nellie, You and me both, stuck with a bad crop of hay. She didn't seem to like his attempt at metaphor, even though he thought it was kind of poetic. So now here he was, staring at the Larkin mansion, his palms sweating. He didn't think he'd be this nervous since it was just all for fun. Whose fun, he didn't know. What you think, Bub? He said, turning to his passenger. Bub, the basset hound, gave him a sad, forlorn look, his eyes red-rimmed at the bottom. Yup. Dax reached over and petted his old dog on the head. This is going to be tough, I know. Well, here goes. Dax studied the 2-story log building once again, with the numerous windows facing out to the west and the matching barn nearby that also had an indoor arena, reportedly for when Nellie wanted to ride her white horse out of the elements. Getting out of his truck, his boots crunched on the lime chip-paved driveway. His steps made a hollow noise on the porch, which had a swing on either side. There was a light quilt on one, with a magazine strewn to the side. Dax angled his head to see what the title was, just as the door flew open. Caught gawking, he straightened. He froze for one long, awkward moment. Nellie was magnificent. She'd put her hair up in a ponytail, curls cascading past her shoulders. Her face glowed with good health and a dusting of adorable freckles. Her lips were covered with gloss that looked delectable. He cleared his throat and tipped his hat. Morning. Good morning, she said, but sounded the opposite. You look pretty, he blurted out. Surprise registered in her eyes, as though she wasn't expecting him to be nice. She opened her mouth and shut it, and then opened it again. Do we really have to do this? She asked. Do what? He pled ignorance. Go on this date. He shrugged, playing for time. Well, I suppose not really. No skin off my back, except... Except? Her eyes narrowed. I already asked someone to do something highly inconveniencing as one part of this date, and they're on their way now as we speak. Doing what? Boy, her green eyes were lovely when she pinned him with that gaze. What more if she actually looked at him with the least bit of attraction? Dream on, Dax. It's a surprise. Her face fell. Okay, then. Don't worry, Dax said. The day will be over before you know it." He said it lightly, as he knew she expected, but the truth was he was miffed that even now, 8 years after that ill-fated Valentine dance, her rejection could still sting. He was a grown man, 26 years old, a true cowboy, and yet every time he was around Nellie, she still managed to make him feel like unwanted scrap from his saddle workbench. "Do you need me to meet your folks or anything?" he said, knowing full well what her answer would be. "Oh, no," she said in a hurry, shutting the door after her. "They're sleeping in." He was, if he were to be honest, disappointed. It would have been kind of fun to see the inside of this forbidden mansion. Ah well, maybe he was better off not meeting the parents anyway. They would most likely grill and serve him for dinner. They walked down to his truck. She hesitated as they got closer, and he saw his vehicle through her eyes. An old brown heap of junk he'd kept running almost as a joke, but now he was actually fond of it. It certainly wasn't built to impress, though, with one cracked headlight, rust along the fenders, and a bent hood where it couldn't be straightened from one too many hay bales fall on it. "We're going in that?" she said. "Well, it's either in this truck or we walk to my house." Her lips tightened. He opened the passenger door, belatedly remembering Bub. "Well," Dax rubbed his nape, "this is a dilemma. Bub here is used to sitting up front." "Bub?" she said, smirking. He marveled at the first hint of a smile on her face. "It's actually short for Bubbles the boy basset hound. My sisters named him that, but we ended up calling him Bub for short. His mom, Althea Brown's basset, was the original Bubbles." She chortled. "Bubbles? Are you for real?" He sighed. She didn't seem to appreciate his very detailed explanation. "And he's a boy?" She crinkled her nose. "You're going to hurt his feelings poking fun at him that way. Of course he's a boy. I can show—" "No thanks," she said, blushing. Their eyes met, and he couldn't breathe. It was like staring into Nellie's soul before she was homecoming queen. Just a simple, sweet girl from home ec, the one he'd had a crush on. No artifice, no derision, just a girl to be with and to like, and maybe even to kiss. At the thought of kissing her, he glanced away. Did he really think he could be in her league, one of the men who had won her heart? "Bub," he said, "get." Bub raised his head and then plopped it down on the seat with a soft sigh. This wasn't going to work. "How old is he?" she said. "Probably 20. "Shouldn't he be dead by now?" Her voice squeaked. "Maybe more like 12. "I can sit in the back," she said. "I don't like dog hair on my clothes anyway." "Thanks a lot, Bub," Dax muttered under his breath after he got Nellie situated in the back and as he went around to the driver's side. He put the truck in gear, circled the lot, and rumbled out of Nellie's place. "So we're going to your house?" she asked. "Yep." "Why?" "Oh, I thought I'd have you do my dishes and laundry." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She pursed her lips and glared at him, and then looked out the window. He just smiled to himself and whistled. "No, really," she said. "I told you." "It's a surprise," she sighed. Suddenly, his surprise felt real dumb. How could he have possibly thought that a girl like Nellie, used to all sorts of amazing dates in her lifetime, would even have the slightest bit of fun with the things he'd planned? Maybe it wasn't too late to change things up. He could probably find something for them to do in town. But then he thought of his friend Toby, having done his bidding with the $20 bill as a bribe. "Here we are," he said unnecessarily as they pulled into his place. It was about as humble as a place could be in contrast to the Larkin mansion. Still, it was the house his folks had passed down to him, the one he'd grown up in and come to love. He'd fixed it up over the years since their death, but it still looked worn out, like a piece of clothing that had been darned one too many times. The roof, which he'd shored up a while back, still kind of sagged in places. The chimney was missing a few bricks. The window in the upstairs was still jammed funny, not level. But at least the yard was fairly clean. Not spick and span, but free of the junk that had been there while he was growing up. "Want to come in for a moment while I get something?" he asked over his shoulder. She glanced past him through the windshield, and then at Bub. "I guess."
Chapter 4. Nellie. Nellie waited as Dax got out of the driver's seat and went around to the back, opening her door. He stood kind of close, so she had to brush past him a bit on the way out. She caught a whiff of a musk scent, her eyes involuntarily darting toward the scruff on his jaw. With her contacts in place, she could see every handsome detail. The sexy jut of his chin and his prominent Adam's apple. He was all muscle, his body straining against that flannel plaid shirt of his. When did he get all buff? Or maybe the question was, when did she stop noticing him as a handsome guy? She remembered him in high school, kind of tall already then, but nothing like this. Not like some lumberjack who could cut down a tree with a single blow. And he'd been sweet, a true gentleman until that Valentine's dance fiasco, which was kind of a silly mistake on her part. Ever since, he'd turned into a curmudgeon. She'd wished he'd be that sweet guy again. She bit her lip, chastising herself, reminding herself that this was Dax Ellison, the pest, who was always mean, teasing, and making fun of her until sometimes she wanted to cry. She had so far never caved in and cried, and she wasn't about to start acting like she was even remotely interested in him. This was just a charity date, and the sooner it was done and over with, the better. Dax also let Bubbles the boy basset hound out. The dog actually moved this time with the energy of a snail. He sniffed at Nellie's boots and then waddled along as though he had all the time in the world. She'd never been to the Ellison property before. It was at the edge of the part of town she usually never went to. She was surprised by how tidy it looked, considering he was a bachelor and none of his sisters lived here anymore. She'd heard they were all to college or working in the big city. They got to the porch that had 2 rocking chairs next to a pile of wood, and he turned at the door. She'd have to be blind to not notice he was extremely attractive, with not only his buff body, but also with his blue eyes that gazed at her with intensity, as though he could see right through her. Bub plopped himself onto the porch, interrupting the moment. Dax winced. "Pardon the mess," he said. He wasn't kidding. As soon as the door opened, she could see the sprawl of leather everywhere, straps, belts, strips, and saddles, in all stages of construction. From one with just the skeleton of a tree to a pretty finished one in a pale brown that looked like a lady's. Nellie breathed in deeply. She loved the smell of leather. Ever since she was a child, it made her think of her daddy and how he'd hoist her into his big saddle and lead her around on his big horse Sam. "So this is where the magic happens," she said. He glanced over at her as though trying to gauge how serious her statement was. A shudder came over his expression. "Yep." She wondered why he hadn't married all these years, but it was really none of her business. If she probed about that, he might think she was interested in him or something. He scooped up the lady's saddle as if it weighed nothing, his biceps straining in his sleeve. "Okay, I got it," he said. "We can go out the back." She followed him out, picking her way gingerly through the maze of leatherwork and then through the kitchen, where a sink full of dishes sat and some frozen dinner containers were overflowing in a trash can. In the back, the property had some corrals, with what looked like 4 horses, and then sagebrush and field abutting a split-rail fence. "You have this much property back here," Nellie said, stopping to survey it. "Yeah." He stopped too and followed her gaze. 5 acres. She cocked her head. "Why don't you build a nicer house on it?" As soon as the words came out, she regretted them. But he just gave her a crooked smile and said, "Because I like my trashy house the way it is." Through his smile, she could sense the edge in his words. "Sorry," she said. I just meant that there's plenty of room here for a big house." "Now what would I do with a big house?" he said, heading over to the big pen of horses. "Well, maybe you could angle for a wife and kids." "Built-in wife and kids?" "No, I meant—" "I'm just teasing." His eyes darted towards hers before sliding away to the horses. His expression softened. My parents raised me in this house. There are lots of memories between those four walls. My parents, my sisters and I. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down. How long has it been since your parents died? 3 years. His eyes glimmered with tears, and then he blinked them away. My gram may be dying, she said, moisture pricking her own eyes before she caught herself. Sorry, it's not at all like your parents getting killed in a car accident. No need to apologize. He set the saddle on the fence post and studied her. Sounds like she means a lot to you. She does. She stuffed her hands in her pockets and averted her eyes. That was all she would say for now. She didn't think he'd want to hear her go on and on about her sick gram. He grabbed a halter off a hook, glanced at her boots, and then looked all the way up the length of her body, making her cheeks warm. Can you catch a horse? She snatched the rope out of his hands. Of course I can. The question is, why? I thought we could go up and take a trail ride through Leonard's Pass. Won't there still be north-facing snow this time of year there? She asked, glancing at the mountain peak still covered with a sliver of white. Not where we're going, he said. I checked it out last week. The trail's clear to the lake. He paused. Can you ride Western? If I have to. His lip twitched. I'm sorry, I don't have a thoroughbred for you to ride. I only have the nicer quarter horses. She gave him a scathing glance. I beg your pardon? Why, are you partial to thoroughbreds? His eyes widened in innocence, but he didn't fool her. He knew the Larkins bred thoroughbreds for races. That's how Daddy had made much of his money that he'd since parlayed into real estate and other investments. Who am I riding? She asked, eyeing the 4 horses. There were 3 bay ones and a pretty white one. Your pick. They're all equally ornery. Are they all safe? Of course. Now why would I own a bad horse? I meant they won't buck or anything, will they? Not unless you're mean to them. Will that white horse buck? Misty? Nope, she shouldn't. She's actually kind of lazy. You'll have to get after her. Then I'll ride her. I thought you would. He smiled to himself as he went after one of the bay horses with a white sock on its front legs. Uh-huh. Why is that? Because she's a pretty horse for a pretty rider. Was he serious or teasing? She couldn't tell as he was caught up in putting a halter on his horse. She approached Misty, who looked at her with curiosity, and then went back to chewing on little bits of hay on the ground from breakfast. Misty was a pretty horse, with a soft mane and a bit of a rounded belly. Her eyes were a clear blue like her owner's. At the thought of Dax's eyes, Nellie's knees weakened. She shoved that thought aside and busied herself in haltering the horse. The mare came docilely, and Nellie actually felt pleasure in their upcoming ride. Dax had already taken his horse out and tied him to a metal hitching post just outside the pen. The tack's over here, he said, motioning to a small barn. There were some chickens roaming loose and a pig snorting nearby. 3 cats swarmed out of the weather-faded structure. A pretty orange tabby greeted Nellie with a calm expression, while a silver and a black and white hung back, unsure. Nellie picked up the tabby, who immediately settled in her arms. That's Anna, Dax said. Nellie buried her hands in her soft fur. She's so pretty. Yeah, she's the best of the lot, too. Very friendly. Anna squirmed out of Nellie's arms and onto her shoulder. Yeah, I can see that. Ow! What? He glanced over. She just clawed me, the stinker. Nellie crouched to the ground and let the cat off. Probably not on purpose. She just has long nails. I'm used to cats having their nails trimmed. She touched her neck gingerly. Here, he said, walking over to her. Can I see? The scratch? I'm sure it's nothing. He just stood there, waiting. So she rolled her eyes and angled her neck so he could see. He came closer and pulled at her collar, grazing her skin with his fingers. She shivered involuntarily, her breath catching. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he cleared his throat and let go of her collar. Yep, you'll live. His nonchalance annoyed her. She didn't exactly expect him to compliment her neck or anything, but apparently he was immovable. Any other cowboy would be all over her. But even as she thought this, she still tingled from his touch. What if she had turned her head so he wasn't looking at her neck but her lips? Would he have kissed her? Whoa, Nellie. This was Dax Ellison she was talking about, the only cowboy in the world who wasn't falling all over her. The one cowboy she shouldn't go after. She remembered how he used to treat her in high school. Before he'd asked her to that dance and she'd blown it, she'd been excited, and he'd been a sweetheart and a gentleman. But then her longtime crush, the football captain, asked her too, literally 30 minutes after she had accepted Dax's invite. She turned to her girlfriends for advice, not wanting to hurt Dax, but having a hard time figuring out how to handle it. They all said they would oust her from the group if she embarrassed them by choosing a country bumpkin over Noah. It wasn't every day the football captain asked you to the dance. She hadn't been strong enough to risk their threat. She should have expected as much from them. Why she was friends with them back then was sometimes a mystery to her. She didn't miss the drama of high school. So she let Dax down gently in favor of Noah, which she felt crappy about, especially when Noah turned out to be a huge phony. Nellie planned to apologize to Dax at the dance, but he never showed up. Since then, that little high school episode was like a rafter hanging over them with a hornet's nest just waiting to be disturbed. Speaking of rafters, pigeons roosted in the Ellison barn. The building had stalls, but none of them had horses. Dax grabbed a blue pad and a gorgeous saddle that looked nicely worn to a gleaming sheen. He pointed at a fuchsia pink saddle pad. "Do you mind grabbing that? The other stuff's on that hook." "What about a saddle for me?" she asked as she unhooked the tack. "It's out there, waiting for you." "That new pretty one?" she said. "Yep." "Whose is it?" "No one in particular," he shrugged, leading the way out of the barn. "I just make them. And they get snatched up pretty quickly." They returned to the rail where the saddle sat, golden in the sun. "I can see why," she said, trailing her fingers over the intricate leatherwork. "My daddy's birthday is coming up. Maybe we can have you make one for him." "Maybe." "How much do you sell them for?" He shrugged as he tightened his saddle leathers around his horse. 10 grand. Her eyes bugged out. "Wow! They're custom saddles, meticulously made. They last people for ages." He winced. "I hate tooting my own horn, but that's the low end of the scale." "You're kidding." "Nope. One saddle has gone for 50 grand in a silent auction before, for a big charity event in Texas." "Clear in Texas." She finished tightening Misty's cinch, marveling at this information. "Yup." She glanced at him with renewed interest. She'd wondered what kind of livelihood he had, if he could even sustain a living making saddles. She'd sorely underestimated him. "Maybe I need a fancy Western saddle too," she teased. His eyes danced. "For you, it'll be double the price."
Chapter 5. Dax. Nellie's eyes flashed at his outrageous comment. Gotta keep the lady on her toes, Dax decided. Can't let her think he was going soft on her or nothing. Miserable fool that he was. His knees weakened at the memory of her letting him inspect her lovely neck. Quit daydreaming, he chastised himself silently as he pulled himself back to the present. Actually, he would love to sell Nellie a saddle. If nothing else, he was sure she would swoon and tell all her friends, who in turn would line up to buy saddles from him. But it didn't hurt to make her sweat a bit, especially under the warm July sun. Only 10 o'clock and the temperatures were probably already in the 90s, but overhead was a clear blue sky, pretty for a trail ride. He went over to hitch his trusty rusty trailer to his truck and went back for Nellie and the horses. She was making baby talk with Misty, hugging her neck and burying her face against the mare's warmth. "She's a sweetheart," Nellie said. Funny. The more Dax was around Nellie, the more she surprised him. He hadn't expected her, who seemed she'd be partial to expensive horses, to be falling all over a scruffy little mare. They walked alongside each other, leading their horses, and for a moment, Dax indulged in a daydream that he and Nellie could spend their Saturdays this way, going for a trail ride up in the mountains. He snapped back to reality. Saturdays as in plural. What a joke. He was lucky to get this day with Nellie. Lucky or unlucky, depending on how the day went. "You like to ride horses?" he asked as they reached the trailer. She wrinkled her nose. What kind of a question is that? Well, I don't know. I heard you'd done some jumping and English riding while you were younger. Do you still? Oh, that. He motioned for her to give him Misty's rope, but she waved him off, walking with confidence into the trailer. He tried to not stare at her long legs encased in those fine jeans and averted his gaze after she tied Misty in the slanted slot. I mean, I still ride with Daddy, she said, coming out of the trailer. When he has time. He's mostly into real estate deals lately, though. My younger sister and brother are both into 4-H. Mom takes them around for that. I don't like the dust and the long hours, so I usually pretend I'm busy that day. She sighed. I really should help more. I'm just burned out a bit on horses. Dax walked his horse in. With Misty and Jace all situated, Dax shut the door to the trailer. What do you do with your time, then? I help Daddy with his business some, she said. Ah, I see. When you feel like it? She sucked in her breath. Dax Ellison, what are you implying? Nothing. He opened her passenger door and waited, chuckling to himself that he'd gotten a rise out of her. Her face turned ruddy with indignation, and she marched up to him with her fists at her hips. I'm a working girl, I will have you know. He arched an eyebrow. You must admit, working for Daddy when you feel like it isn't the same as working for someone else who wouldn't cut you slack. She opened her mouth and then closed it before getting in the passenger seat, this time basset houndless, her green eyes like a stormy sea. He got in the driver's side and glanced at her real quick. She was still stewing, so he drove on, whistling. Do you mind? She snapped. Your whistling drives me nuts. Yes, ma'am, he said, chuckling. He tapped the wheel instead, and she glared at him. No whistling, no tapping. He sighed. They drove on wordlessly for 10 minutes until they reached a pullout where there were a couple of other trailers. When he came around to open her door, she'd already climbed out and slammed it shut. Whoa, touchy. He followed her to the trailer door, where she whirled on him. Now listen, Dax Ellison, she said, poking at his chest. I work hard like anyone else, not like some people who make saddles and put them up for outrageous prices. It was his turn to put his fists on his hips. What do you know about making saddles? Well, she said, sounding uncertain. You get a tree and put on some leather and voila, a saddle. He guffawed. You are unbelievable. Well, I mean, I know there's a bit more work involved. You've got that right. He stopped laughing, his jaw tightening. I work hard for each saddle, and I'm sure proud of each and every one that passes through my door. She took a deep breath, like she was trying not to cry. She turned again and leaned a hand against the trailer. Her pretty manicured nails glowed like a bouquet of flowers in the sun. He rubbed his nape. Listen, sorry. She remained turned away from him. I was harsh back there. I'm sure you work hard at your daddy's office. Slowly, she faced him, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. Are you apologizing, Dax Ellison? I suppose, he winced. That's what I think sorry means. I'm going to have to put this in my diary tonight. She gave him a little smile. Apology accepted. When she smiled like that, she looked sweet, approachable. Maybe this trail ride wasn't going to be a bust after all.
Chapter 6. Nellie. Dax's words stung, because they were true. Nellie hated to admit that Dax was actually correct about something. She thought back to how her daddy had her work set up for her, and she couldn't help but feel rather mortified. She came whenever she wanted, passed her daddy's secretary, Molly, at the reception area, and then spent a couple of hours doing whatever she pleased. This week, she sat in on a couple of real estate transactions. Last week, it was a lunch appointment with Daddy and the CEO of the local bank. If she didn't show up, nothing would get derailed. It would be business as usual. Still, it gave her pride to go into the office, look at her gleaming white customized office desk, make a couple of calls on her old-fashioned white rotary phone, and call it a day. She let Dax take out the horses, watching him with eyes that refused to cry. Despite his apology, she didn't trust him enough to let him see her weakness. Already, he knew he had gotten under her skin, and she was sure he would use that against her someday. For now, she wouldn't talk to him. She glanced up the little rise that formed Leonard's Pass. What a long trail ride this would be. She got on Misty, glad that at least Dax couldn't fault her for her horse riding skills. They moved away from the trailer, the saddle feeling perfect under her. She shot a glance at Dax. He'd been staring at her, but quickly averted his eyes. No doubt he was thinking up ways to sabotage her trail ride experience, maybe even how to get Misty to buck her off. "Go on, Jace," he said, clicking. Jace, so that was the name of his horse. "This way," Dax said, jerking his head to the left where the trailhead began. Behind him, Nellie watched as Dax maneuvered his horse through the opening in the rail fence and clipped on up the unpaved trail. He sat well in his saddle, like a true cowboy, manly and capable. She adjusted her hat to the sun and looked away, focusing on the scenery. The last thing she wanted to be caught doing was gawking at Dax Ellison. The wildflowers were in full bloom, little yellow ones mingling with purple sage. So lovely. She hadn't been up here in a while. The silence felt awkward at first, but soon she actually enjoyed it. For a change, she didn't have to think, just let her hips naturally move with Misty's gait. Jace was a bossy horse, wanting to get ahead just as Misty caught up with him. Nellie didn't mind just following. That way she didn't have to be within the range of Dax's critical eyes. A rabbit sprang from the bushes and hopped across their path. A falcon swooped overhead and dove for its prey. The trail sloped down into a breathtaking meadow. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Dax asked. "Yes, it is." He glanced over his shoulder with a smile. His blue eyes held her gaze before skittering away. She felt dazed, unsure what had hit her. "My saddle's real nice," she said, and then kicked herself because who said lame things like that? Dax pulled at his reins and let Misty catch up with Jace. "Good. I figured some lady might like it someday. If I did more Western riding, I might be interested in it." He scrunched his nose, the action oddly adorable. Not that she would ever admit that Dax looked adorable. "You still into all that English riding?" "Sometimes. Now that I haven't been competing, what's the point in practicing?" "What have you been up to lately, then?" he asked. "Up to? You know, hobbies, new things, travel." She shrugged. "Oh, just the usual. Working, shopping, visiting my sick Gram." She thought of Gram, of how she'd declined in the last few weeks. Gram had to endure the care center nurses poking her all day and had to take a million pills that made her queasy. Gram used to say, "Cowgirl up," when Nellie whined about something. Gram lived it. Dax darted a glance at Nellie. "What's she sick of?" "Her heart's been giving her problems." "How old is she again?" 86. Dax's expression gentled. "She's a tough little lady. She'll probably outlive us all." She hoped he was right. Even though she didn't put a lot of stock in Dax's words, they did calm her. Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them away. They came to a little rise. Dax pulled Jace to a stop, and Nellie followed suit with Misty. They overlooked a beautiful canyon with a ribbon of river surrounded by green pasture. "My office," he said, with pride in his voice. "I pasture my herd on this public land." "Do you like that kind of freedom?" she asked. "Oh, sure. I can't work for anyone, I've decided. I like to come and go as I please." "How many head of cattle do you own?" "About 50. She glanced at him in surprise. "You're not fooling?" "Now why would I make that number up?" His eyes danced. "It's not like I need to impress you or anything." "You'll have to do a lot more to impress me," she teased back. "Oh?" He turned fully to look at her. So tell me, Nellie, what would it take for a cowboy to impress you? Well, for one, a cowboy needs to be a gentleman. Someone who treats me nicely. He compliments me instead of berating me constantly. He nodded. Point taken. He needs to have his own business, or at least a great job. Okay. Likes to watch movies with me. The tear-jerking kind. He winced. We're talking about a manly cowboy here, right? She ignored him. He brings me flowers. He smells like a good aftershave, but not too much cologne. She wrinkled her nose. He's strong and brave and will protect me from danger. He chops wood and has nice muscles, and of course, he's a good kisser. His eyes caught hers in an intense glance, and then the happy-go-lucky gleam was back. A good kisser, he mused. What makes for a good kiss? The kind that gives you fireworks. She looked into his eyes. The kind that takes you somewhere else beautiful, out of your ordinary, makes you dream and yearn. She smiled sheepishly. Silly, I know. He cleared his throat and gazed over the valley. Yeah, I bet no one kisses like that in real life, just in those romance books. She gazed at his profile. Oh, what do you know about romance novels? My sisters are always reading them. I sometimes catch one lying around. Makes for a nice afternoon of root beer snorting out of my nose. Just admit it, Dax Ellison. You sneak around reading those romances, she smirked. Right, between taking the cows to pasture, making saddles, and breaking my horses, I read romance novels. He rolled his eyes. Sorry to disappoint you, but if I wanted romance, I'd just as soon get it in real life. Me too. Nellie found herself in an odd position, agreeing with Dax. He eyed her uncertainly. Last I heard, you and that Tim Jennings broke up. Is that right? Yep, thank goodness. Turned out a dud, huh? He was nice enough, but too bland, like oatmeal without sugar. I want a take charge kind of guy who will stand up to me. Huh. He shifted in his saddle. I can't see anyone being able to tell you what to do, Nellie. You got that right. She sighed. I'll probably die a spinster. He glanced at her, drawing up one corner of his mouth. Well, he drawled, let me tell you what to do. She arched an eyebrow. Excuse me? He grinned. Let's go down to the lake, shall we?
Chapter 7. Dax. Dax was actually enjoying himself. It was nice when Nellie finally came down from her high horse to talk to a lowly cowboy like him. Romance novels. Funny about that, they were melodramatic and unrealistic. Now, as far as kisses, though, Nellie's dreamy expression returned to him, those beautiful green eyes softening, her rosy lips parting and wishing for that kiss. Why, it was enough for a cowboy like him to oblige her with a kiss if he could, if she'd let him. Truth of the matter was, he would sure like to be that cowboy, to give her the fireworks, to give her an extraordinary experience. Too bad he couldn't even get anywhere close to the door. This was Nellie Larkin he was talking about, the one who didn't like him in high school and didn't like him now. So what if he was a cowboy? She had plenty of cowboys to choose from. If it wasn't a Tim, it would be a Jimmy, or a Frank, or Eli. He adjusted his hat, listening for Nellie behind him. He didn't dare ride alongside. The last thing he wanted to do was to tip her off that he was getting soft on her. He'd be paying more attention to her than to the trail ride, and what good would that do anyone? He caught a glimpse of the blue lake, his chest loosening. It was so pretty, with the blue mirroring the clear azure sky. The horses slowed as they came down the hill, picking their hooves through the sagebrush and around rabbit holes. As they approached, Dax noted with relief that his friend had set up the picnic as he'd asked. There was a little equipment trailer set up alongside a table with a cloth and 2 chairs. Toby had done a good job. We're heading for that trailer, Dax explained. Okay. When they got there, they were just a few yards from the lake beach. So pretty, Nellie said, dismounting gracefully. She tied her horse to a sturdy branch and sauntered over to the water's edge. Crouching down, she dipped her finger in. "Brr," she said. "That's cold." "Surprising, isn't it?" Dax said, getting off his horse as well. "Guess the runoff makes it freeze up." "So," she whirled upon the table and gazed at it. "What are we doing?" "We're having a picnic." He tied his horse up and hesitated. "Do you mind giving me a hand?" She jumped right in. Once again, she kept surprising him. "I love setting tables," she said. He smiled. "Have at it then." She winked. "Just watch the master." Her little wink made his blood rush to his head. Funny thing, his reaction to her. Why, you'd almost think he had a thing for her still, after all these years. So he watched her. He sat on the tongue of the trailer, chewing on a blade of grass while she set the plates and utensils in the right places. Then it was on to the little plastic glasses that probably were throwaways in her household. She acted like they were nice china. "Voila," she said. "You're good." "Home economics sophomore year, 5th period with Mrs. Maskell." "Yes," he murmured. "I remember." Boy, did he remember. "I also like to make things pretty." Pretty. With Nellie standing like that, framed by the blue lake and mountains, she was sure pretty. Averting his eyes, Dax chewed some more on his piece of grass and stood. Time to roll out lunch. He entered the trailer and came out with a pan covered with aluminum foil. He set it in the middle of the table and took off the foil. The ribs had been smoked to perfection, if he could say so himself. Nellie approached the table and bent over the pan, sniffing. Smells so good." His heart skipped a beat at her nearness. If he leaned over the table too, she would be close enough to kiss. He put the foil back over the pan and focused on getting the other fixings ready. He brought more containers out, still warm from being in the cooler. "There's coleslaw, potato salad, rolls, and corn on the cob." "Yum." Nellie's face glowed. "Have a seat, ma'am," he said. She giggled and sat, gazing down happily at the spread. And then she shot up. "Oh, wait," she said. "I need to wash my hands." She glanced at him like he was smelly. "You should too." "You sound like my Aunt Evelyn." "Well, when you're around horses, you need to wash up before every meal." "I thought it was the other way around. You get so dirty, you just don't bother." To humor her, he got some soap out of the trailer and shared. They washed in the cold lake water and sat back down, but she wasn't done reforming him. She gazed at him expectantly. "We need to say grace," she said, leaning over with a whisper. "Right." He took his hat off. "I can offer it." She closed her eyes. "Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our bounty. Thank you for this beautiful place we live in. And thank you for Dax Ellison, for all his effort in making this a fun day for me. Amen." "Thanks," Dax said, his cheeks warming for the special mention. "You're welcome." She glanced at the ribs. "This is a lot of work." He shrugged. "It's what I know to make. I bet you eat fancier on your other dates." "This looks pretty fancy." Dax smiled to himself, relieved he'd pleased her. She picked up a rib and started enjoying it, munching on it with her fingers and face getting barbecue sauce all over them like she didn't care. He picked up a rib too, and soon they were rivaling each other for the most rib sauce around their mouths. "Oh my goodness," she said, setting down a bone. "These ribs are amazing." She stared at him. "Where have you been all my life?" "In Sunny Ridge," he said lightly. "You should open a rib joint," she suggested. "I shouldn't. I don't see how I could keep it afloat. Besides, there's Sylvia's dad's diner. They cook some great ribs." She set down her food and wiped her mouth daintily with her napkin. "She tried to outbid me for you." "Who? Sylvia?" Yes. She tore a piece of her roll and popped it in her mouth. I guess she must like you. He shrugged. She's been a good friend for forever. Maybe she just wanted to get a cowboy she could talk to. Or a cowboy who's easy on the eyes. She glanced at him and then dropped her gaze to her plate. Did Nellie Larkin just compliment him? Why, thank you, Dax said. It's the hat. Her glance lingered on his eyes, his jaw, his mouth. Yep, she said, biting her lip. It's all in the hat. Suddenly, he couldn't remember what they were talking about. She picked up a rib and took a bite. Setting it down, she drank from her glass. On her cheek, she had a smudge of rib sauce. You've got sauce on your cheek, Dax said. She reached up and rubbed on the wrong spot. Did I get it? He shook his head. Here? She tried again. Nope. He leaned over and brushed it off with his thumb. First time in his life to touch her smooth cheek, and his body came alive like a barbecue grill heating up. There, he murmured. They were just an arm's length away, close enough to kiss, certainly close enough to touch. His thumb made slow circles on her cheek, and her eyes widened, staring at him too, like she was feeling the same way. Was she as pleasantly surprised at how this date was going as he was? A horse snorted, breaking the mood. Thanks, she said, leaning back and away from his touch. He resisted the urge to suck the sauce off his thumb. You're welcome.
Chapter 8. Nellie. What was that? One moment, Dax was cleaning her face, and the next, she was thinking of being, yearning to be, kissed by him. Eat up, he said, pointing at the ribs. I'm not keeping any of it. She patted her belly. I'm full, thanks. That was good. It's easy to make. What, throw it on the grill and forget it? Pretty much. Just need to slather the sauce, foil, and let it cook for a while. He eyed her plate. Are you done? We probably should clean up and head back soon. Yeah, good idea. Was it really time to go? It seemed they hadn't been out for that long, and here Nellie thought she'd be stuck with him on a tedious, boring day. She helped him clear the table. There was nothing like bringing order and organization to chaos. She handed him the dishes, and he gave her a lopsided smile. Thanks. Tucking her hair behind her ear, she turned away to hide the confusion she felt. Dax was actually a pretty nice guy. When he wasn't cracking sarcastic jokes or teasing her, that is. Hey, can I ask you a question? He asked. She turned to look at him. He was wiping his hands on a rag. Sure, she said. His hands stilled. Why'd you bid on me? It was a mistake. Oh, well, I understand that. You made that mighty clear when it happened, but why did you even bid on a cowboy? She bit her lip and studied him. Can you keep a secret? His eyes gleamed. Depends. On what? On if it's illegal or not. I was going to tell you about a convenience store I robbed. She rolled her eyes. Of course it's legal. Okay, shoot. I need a boyfriend to show off to my gram. He threw the rag back into the trailer and hitched his thumbs on his belt loops. You need a boyfriend? A fake boyfriend, she added hurriedly. He blinked. Nellie Larkin has to bid on a cowboy to get a boyfriend. She frowned. Well, yes. I found that hard to believe. That's how it is. He came closer, making her feel self-conscious, vulnerable. You could have anyone you want. Except you. Where did that thought come from? Nellie shook her head to clear it. Dax would never be in the running, of course. He'd made that perfectly clear. Besides, she wasn't a glutton for punishment. I could, she said, but I don't want anything messy. It's basically to make her happy before she passes. She could any day now. Her voice broke. He scratched his head. Why would you, having a boyfriend, make her happy? She's always asking me if I'm dating someone. She's worried I won't ever get married, thinks I'm flighty, wants me to settle down, so I thought I would come in with a cowboy and present him as a boyfriend. She winced. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? Well, yeah, a little. He stood so close she wanted to touch the sexy stubble on his jaw. What if the fake turns real? She blinked. I hadn't thought of that. There's no chance that'll happen. Oh, because it's just one visit with my gram, after our auction date, tonight. So, he massaged his jaw. I'm the fake boyfriend. I guess so. They should have charged you more at the auction, he said. I mean, this'll require some acting, maybe some kissing. The air between them grew charged. Kissing, she squeaked. Well, yeah. Won't we need to convince her that we're in love? In love? She began to put a hand up to fluff her hair, feeling too warm all of a sudden. Instead, she let it fall to her side. Concern was etched on his face. If you don't, she'll be worried about you just having your cowboy of the month. She blinked. You know, you're right. Graham's pretty sharp for an 80-something-year-old lady. There's no way we can pull the wool over her eyes. Oh, I'm sure we can convince her. He walked to her side. I could, for example, put my arm around you, like so. He slid his arm around her waist. She continued to heat up, all tingly. She turned her head toward him and could smell sunshine on his clothes, sweet hay. Or we could hold hands. He moved his arm and clasped her hands in his thumb caressing her skin. We could? She murmured faintly. He nodded. We could look deep into each other's eyes. He held her other hand and turned her until they were standing toe-to-toe. His blue eyes gazed into hers, melting her insides. Electricity seemed to pulse through their linked hands. Clearing his throat, he let her go and stepped away. Something like that, see? Easy peasy. She felt weak-kneed. Maybe she was getting too much sun. Easy peasy, she echoed in a breathless voice.
Chapter 9. Dax. Oh, man. What had he gotten himself into? We'll hold hands, Nellie. I'll put my arm around you, Nellie. Easy peasy. Dax groaned inwardly. It was all he could do to stop himself from kissing Nellie when he was staring deeply into her eyes. He cleaned up from the picnic, stashing everything in the trailer, and turned back to Nellie. She faced away from him, her wavy shoulder-length red hair blowing in the breeze. She was skipping rocks. For one moment he indulged himself the fantasy that he and Nellie would skip rocks at some lakefront for their honeymoon. He adjusted his hat and walked over to stand beside her. She blushed when she realized he was watching. I'm not a very good shot, she said. Is there such a thing as a good shot when it comes to skipping stones? Sure, she said. I can only get 2 or 3. That's not very good. Let's see how many I can get. Dax skipped one, and it skipped 52 times, Nellie exaggerated. Okay, so I counted 10. Seriously? That's pretty good rock skipping. There's nothing to it, he smiled. It comes down to the flick of the wrist, like releasing clay pigeons. Oh, I get it then. I've released them before. With a manual thrower? Yep. Okay, let's see you do it. She pulled back her arm and got 5 this time. Better. He hesitated for a moment and then stood behind her. See. He put his left hand on her waist and his other hand pulled back her arm. She glanced at him over her shoulder. He could see her lashes, thick and reddish, spread across her cheeks. She was biting her lip in a very appealing way that he was starting to look forward to. His blood hummed even as he tried to focus on the task at hand. You just pull back, Dax whispered into her ear. Yes, she murmured. And flick it, like so. She skipped the stone. Her hair tickled his neck. Her perfume tantalized him. He wanted to turn her in his arms and kiss her senseless. There, she said. "I got 6. Personal record." "Good girl," Dax said, reluctantly letting her go. He stepped back. He watched her skip more stones, his mounting desire for this girl not abating. She was beautiful, full of life, playful. She could be hot-headed and spoiled, but she had a good heart. How wrong had he been about her? But it was too late. How could she see beyond the cowboy who teased her mercilessly to the cowboy who wanted to cherish her? Opening himself up to her once again filled him with fear. He couldn't risk rejection again, could he? "All right," she said, turning to him. "I'm done. What's next?" "I thought it would be fun to have the horses play in the water." "Won't it be too cold for them?" "No, they won't be in for too long. We can go out to a bit of the deep and then head back." "Okay." As they were gathering the horses, he thought he felt her eyes on him, but when he turned, she looked pretty intent on tightening her cinch. After she mounted, she asked, "Who's going to take the trailer away?" "My friend Toby's coming back for it." "That's nice of him to help." "Well, he owes me a few favors." Dax clucked, coaxing Jace into the water. Too bad it wasn't a super hot day. It would feel even better and help the horses cool off. He turned to check on Nellie. Misty was entering the lake enthusiastically, with large strides that splashed all over. And then he noticed something. "Oh no," he said. "Misty, no!" But it was too late. All Nellie could do was to glance at him with a question in her eyes, while Misty deliberately tipped to her side, rolling in the water. Nellie screamed as Misty brought them both down with a big splash. Nellie disappeared into the water while her good-for-nothing horse rolled back up and shook, splashing everywhere. Dax rode his horse over and jumped in the water. Crikey, it was cold. "Nellie," he called out, frantic. What if she drowned? What if Misty stepped on her? What if... Nellie burst out of the water, sputtering, her red hair plastered all over. She looked like the creature from the deep, if it had red hair and wore mascara streaking down its cheeks. "Dax Ellison!" she screamed. Hi, Nellie." Relief washed over him. "Glad you didn't drown." "I'll show you who I'm drowning," she snarled. But she didn't get very far in attacking him. Her teeth began to chatter and her body began to tremble. "Let's get you out of the water, sweetheart," he said, reaching for her. She shook off his hand. "Don't you touch me!" She half swam, half waded to the beach where she surveyed her soaking clothes. "I might have a blanket in the trailer," he said. Turning, she glared at him. So much for Nellie giving him a chance. Any future they might have had together had been scuttled by the stupid horse. He went into the trailer and found a blanket, but it looked like it hadn't been washed in a while. He pulled on it and a mouse came scurrying out. With his bad luck, he might give Nellie the bubonic plague. He glanced back at her. She stood where she had stopped, her lips turning a sickly color. They needed to get her dry and changed out of her clothes. He approached her with the blanket. "Nellie, listen to me." She lifted her eyes and sent daggers his way. "You need to get out of those clothes." "You wish." "And into a blanket. But this one had a mouse and a few droppings in it. Not a lot. Do you care?" "A mouse?" Her eyes grew round. "Ew!" "It was live. A cute one." "That's not any better." He sighed. "Let me build us a fire, okay?" "My hair and makeup are ruined," she said through her chattering teeth. Glancing at her, he didn't think she looked bad at all. Kind of like a poor waif needing a hug or something. He knew better than to offer her one, though. He gathered driftwood and found a lighter in the trailer to build a fire on the beach. Gesturing to the fire, Dax stepped away. He was kind of cold, too, with his jeans soaked from wading, but he didn't care so much about him. He wanted to make sure Nellie was comfortable. She came over and sat by the fire, rubbing her hands up and down her arms. She gave him a sidelong glance. "You're pretty soaked, too. Why not sit by the fire? Her offer surprised him. After that spectacular dunking, he was sure she wouldn't want to have anything to do with him. I didn't want to crowd you. She hugged her legs. There's plenty of room. Thanks. He came over and lowered himself to the ground. Sorry, I haven't taken Misty on a trail ride in a while. I didn't know she'd do that. Her glance darted toward him, and her expression lightened. She started to giggle. It was actually kind of funny, she said. The giggle turned to laughter. He joined in too, and when it all subsided, their glances locked, making Dax's pulse race. Will the water ruin your saddle? She asked. The saddle? He blinked. Nah, it'll dry just fine. She bit her lip. Maybe I'll have that blanket after all. He sprang up to get it, shook it out away from her, and draped it over her shoulder. You can share it with me, she said, glancing at him from under her lashes. Did she really mean that? He wasn't going to turn her down. When he did sit beside her, he still left a bit of room between them, but there wasn't much space. They sat so close he could turn and take her in her arms. But what he could do, and what she'd appreciate, were two very different things. Dax stared at the fire, his body relaxing at the peaceful scene. The lake beyond the fire, the sandy beach, this beautiful woman beside him. I look like a mess, don't I? She said. He didn't have far to turn so that she was right in his gaze. Her hair was in clumps, flat and framing her face. Her mascara had smeared, and her makeup was non-existent. You're actually pretty, in a natural way, he said, reaching over and pushing back the hair from her face. His fingertips touched her smooth cheek, and he felt a tremor run through her body. His gaze flicked to her lips and then away. With difficulty, he pulled back and hugged his knees. She touched her hair. I wish I had brought a comb or something. I might be able to find you a horse brush in the trailer. She scrunched her nose. No thanks. She watched the fire for a bit and then asked, You gonna see my gram then? Sure. A bonus on this auction date. It'd be awfully nice of you. She tells me she doesn't like visitors, but I think she secretly does. What if she doesn't approve of me? I'll just tell her I plan to dump you. That would have to be a record breakup. I think Frank Beatty has you beaten. 2 hours in kindergarten. We got married at recess, and then he found a new wife by the end of the day. They laughed. You got folks still around Sunny Ridge? She asked. After my parents died? He shook his head. Nah. My mom's mom lives somewhere near Durango. You ever visit her? Around holidays and such. I think it's cool that you're close to your gram. She was quiet, and then she said, It started off like one of those chores. I had to go see her or she wouldn't give me birthday money kind of thing. I don't know when it changed. Maybe the day when I went in and we visited the beauty shop together. She traced a line in the sand. She lives at Ruby Marie's. That's a nice place. It should be. We own it. Aha. Well, part of it. My dad's partners with the other owner. Is there nothing that your family isn't a part of? She shrugged. I don't know. I have no idea, really. I don't need to know. She blushed. I mean, I understand, he said. It's not like you're running the business or anything. Precisely. It felt good to sit by the fire, tucked in a warm blanket with Nellie. The longer they spent time together, the longer he craved for more. But since their date was supposed to last only a day, he might as well cut short whatever this was. He plucked at her jean leg, which still felt wet. I'd just as soon sit here drying all day, but you probably want to get back to see your gram before midnight. Yep. She took the blanket off her shoulder and handed it to him. "Thanks." "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank the mouse."
Chapter 10. Nellie. Nellie felt much better after she got home, stripped of her stiff, damp clothing and showered. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Pretty without makeup, Dax had said. Natural. Her eyes were overbright, like she was excited about something, like she was excited to see Dax again. Oh dear, how could she think of her enemy Cowboy that way? Truth was, he had surprised her all day. He had turned out funny, sweet, and gentlemanly. He could have run like a banshee when his stinker of a horse decided to go for a swim and turned her into a mess, but he acted like he didn't notice. Did he still think of her as a spoiled brat? He continued to tease her, but the nature of his jab seemed to have changed, more fun than mean. Could this be a turning point in their relationship? She reapplied lipstick and stared at her mouth. Several times today, she had wanted him to kiss her. The memory made her body tingle. She imagined Dax taking her in his arms, his hand touching the small of her back, and dipping his head down for a kiss he couldn't get enough of. She blew her breath out, noticing her rosy cheeks, daydreaming about a cowboy she couldn't have, because he was hers only for a day. The thought weighed her down. She styled her hair minimally, just blow-drying it a titch. Her hair had always been her nemesis until she got into high school, and then everyone wanted to be a redhead like her. Finally, she dabbed on a bit of makeup, lip gloss, light mascara, powder. More natural, more of what Dax liked, since they'll be a fake couple for her Graham. She hoped Graham would like him. Dax was waiting on the porch, sitting on one of the swings. As she came out, he stood. The porch light wasn't on yet. It was that halfway point in the evening when it was neither light nor dark. Earlier, he'd asked if she wanted a burger for dinner, but she declined. She wanted to head over to see her Graham early before she got too tired for visitors. Now she almost wished they could have that meal together. This was just a one-day charity date, she reminded herself. What else was she expecting? That he'd fall for her and they'd make the fake real? It was better this way, less complicated. Dax was almost too real. If they were to date, he'd be poking at her insecurities, unlike her other boyfriends who just let her do whatever she wanted. If they were to date, if was the operative word. It almost seemed like a joke. They had been enemies for so long that she didn't know how to be his friend, let alone girlfriend. In the darkness, Dax looked mysterious, strong and capable. All her thoughts about him hating her and her fighting him fell away. With a little surge of panic, she realized she wanted him as she'd never wanted anyone before. She wanted him to be waiting on her porch for her for more than a night. She wanted to go to his saddle workshop and watch him work and maybe distract him with a kiss on his neck. "Hey," he said. His voice was deep and husky, making her stomach flip with pleasure. "Hey." He moved his hand as though to touch her hair, but let it fall back down. "You look pretty." She wished he would touch her. "Thanks." His eyes were in shadow. Could Dax possibly be attracted to her too? Maybe she just imagined it. After all, this was Dax she was talking about. "Let's go see Graham," she said, forcing herself to move away from him and down the steps. All business, as it should be, even as she yearned for more. Chapter 11. Nellie. On the way to Ruby Marie's in his truck, Nellie felt quiet. The truck bumped along, each mile closer, making her more apprehensive. "This was probably not a good idea," she said as he pulled into the care center's lot. Dax parked and turned to her. "What isn't?" "I shouldn't be lying to my Graham," she said, biting her lip. "Not about this, anyway." He rested an arm on the top of his steering wheel. "What would be okay to lie to her about?" "Well, there's what her diagnosis is, how long she really has to live, that kind of thing." "How long?" "Any day now," the doctor said. Her chest tightened with sadness. "Then maybe you should do it, if it would make her happy. She gazed at him uncertain. You think? Sure, it's not hurting anyone. I mean, you and I know it's not real. No one else will know. And you and I will be over after tonight. His words stung. Yeah, you're right. He helped her out of the truck, and they made their way down a circular driveway to the glass doors. It was a pretty building, all lit up with elegant lampposts. The manager had done a great job sprucing it up. Even though Sunny Ridge was just a small town, Ruby Marie's could rival any care center in metropolitan Denver. They signed in at the front desk and set off to Graham's room. Since their family owned the care center, she'd been given one of the nicer suites. She had a sitting room and her own bedroom. Nellie glanced at Dax. She was glad he was there with her. She was actually looking forward to showing Graham off to him and vice versa. Here goes, she said, opening the door. Graham's sitting room smelled of lilies, her favorite flower. A bouquet adorned the little table by a couch and love seat. A portrait of her as a younger woman was hung over the fireplace. Nellie knocked on her bedroom door. We're closed, Graham said. Nellie smiled as she opened the door. Hi, Graham. Graham was in bed, her covers over her, wearing a pretty nightgown with lace at the edges. Her hair, her pride and joy, had already been taken down for the night. It fell past her shoulder, a pure silver gray. She was one of those lucky people who could get away with gray hair because their natural color was so beautiful. Her eyes lit up at Nellie's entrance. Thank goodness. I thought it was another nurse come to poke me with a needle. Nellie walked over and kissed her on the cheek. I want you to meet someone, she said. Over her shoulder, she beckoned for Dax to come forward. Graham, this is Dax Ellison. Dax, my Graham. Hello, ma'am, Dax said. Bless my soul, Graham said, her eyes nearly popping out. My eyes aren't as good as they used to be, but I know a hunk when I see one. She turned to Nellie. What you doing with a cowboy like that? Are you cattle rustling? Nellie smiled. He has his own cattle, Graham. He's beefy, all right. Dax blushed. How are you feeling today, Graham? Nellie asked. Feisty. They wouldn't give me a second slice of chocolate cake, so I raised Cain. That second slice tasted mighty fine. Nellie laughed and shook her head. Graham, you're such a troublemaker. You and me, kid. When are you finally settled down? As a matter of fact, she said, glancing at Dax, I wanted you to know that I have a boyfriend. But you're running around with this one? Though I can see why. Nellie giggled. Dax is my boyfriend. Well, I'll be, Graham said. I thought he was just a stray handsome cowboy you found in the hallway. She lowered her voice. Go find me one too, won't you? They laughed. Graham gripped Nellie's hand and studied her ring finger. No ring. No, Graham, Nellie said. We just started dating. Which family do you descend from? Dax, is it? Ellison's, ma'am. Ah, the Ellison horses. Yes, ma'am. She pinned him with her gaze. So are you Charlie's boy? Yes, ma'am. You look just like him. Dax hesitated and then said, You know he's been gone for 3 years now. In a car accident. Yes, that's right. Graham's mouth trembled. Him and your beautiful mother. Dax gave her a pained smile. They were taken too soon. Graham's glance drifted, seemingly lost in the past. Nellie sat on the edge of the bed and glanced at Dax. What would it be like to lose your parents so early in your life? Graham roused. Tell me how you're doing, Nellie. For the next several minutes, Nellie told her Graham about her work, a family trip they were planning to Nashville, and how her parents were doing. Your daddy needs to call me more, Graham said, even though Nellie knew for a fact that Daddy did visit Graham often. Graham's eyes strayed over to Dax. You're awfully quiet over there, young man. How old are you? 26. Your age, Nellie, good. We don't want some cradle snatcher. Graham reached up with a trembling hand and pushed back Nellie's hair. You look different, darling. Did you get your hair cut? No, Graham, I just didn't put on as much makeup. I told her she looks pretty that way, Dax said. Nellie raised her eyes to his and smiled. You'll have to do better than that, young man, Graham said. She gets told every day she's beautiful. What have you got to set you apart? I don't know. I guess I'm lucky to win Nellie, considering I'm no one special. You are too, Nellie piped up. The corners of Dax's eyes crinkled with amusement. Nellie's cheeks warmed, and she turned her attention back to Graham. Are you feeling good enough to come to our 4th of July party? Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss that for anything, Graham pointed at Dax. Are you taking him? Nellie stood in a hurry and tried to block Graham's view of Dax. Out of sight, out of mind. I think Dax is busy that day. Actually, sweetheart, Dax said, approaching Nellie and setting his hands on her shoulders, I should be available. His touch nearly undid her. What were they talking about? Oh, yes, the 4th of July party. It was only the biggest Larkin family party of the year. If Dax were to come with her, it would be the most awkward thing. He was supposed to be her boyfriend for this one visit with Graham, but if he came, the whole family would see them together. Oh, but you wouldn't want to, Nellie told Dax, squirming out of his hands and turning to face him. It's the most boring party. Dax's eyes danced. So he was having fun at her expense, was he? Only if you're dead, Graham said, cackling. Whatever you have that day, cancel it, young man. You bet I will, Dax told Graham, defying Nellie. Nellie closed her eyes and then opened them, communicating her disdain for Dax. No more Miss Nice Cowgirl.
Chapter 12. Dax. Dax braced himself for Nellie's eruption. It happened as soon as they got out of the care center. What were you thinking? Nellie said, whirling upon him as they walked to his truck. Why did you have to tell Graham you can go to the party? Dax stifled a smile as he opened her door and then walked around to the driver's seat. Because he knew it was going to get Nellie's goat? Instead of admitting that, as he started the truck and pulled out, he said, She was very persuasive. You think this is some kind of a game? She groaned. I can't bring you. Why not? Because everyone will think you and I are dating for real. He scratched his head. We just told your Graham tonight that we are. That was different. She was the only one who would know. This party, however, has all my uncles, aunts, cousins, friends of cousins, friends of friends of... Yes, I can imagine. And then Sunny Ridge will be all abuzz about you and me. It'll give people something to talk about. There'll be talk, all right. Nellie covered her face with her hands. This was even more fun than Dax expected. Nellie's well-laid plans were all skewered, thanks to her feisty Graham. This whole fake cowboy boyfriend deal was Nellie's scheme. Dax was going to go along for the ride and enjoy himself. He said, straight-faced, Maybe I'll come down with shingles on the 4th. Gosh, I hope so. Her hands muffled her words. Thank you. Or mono. And then your Graham will have to tell everyone that you might be sick too. Ew! She emerged from behind her hands, looking despondent. Is it really so bad to date me? He half joked. Nellie gave him a sidelong glance. Do you even have to ask that? We both know you hate my guts. Me? Dax pointed at his chest. I hate your guts? Yes. Why else would you always be teasing and insulting me? He glimpsed the frustration on her face, mirroring his own. He wished she knew the truth, but telling her he was beginning to fall for her once again would tip her off. He wanted more from their relationship than she was obviously willing to give. She couldn't even stand the thought of being with him for more than a day. Dax winced. I guess I just got in the habit. Well, if it's any consolation, I don't hate your guts. It's okay. There could be worse things than bringing you to the family party. You're so good for a man's ego, he muttered. What did you say? Nothing. Louder, he said. Okay, like what? My cousin Wayne singing America the Beautiful? I don't know how he sings, but I will take your word for it. Her expression darkened. Or being stuck in this town with the reputation of a spoiled rich girl who's living in her daddy's shadow. She took a deep breath. Hey, don't be too hard on yourself. She averted her face, her profile lovely in the moonlight. You said as much earlier. I have my job because of my daddy, nothing to do with my hard work, qualifications, or anything. I think most people would love to be in your shoes for a day. Would they? Why would anyone want to be the joke of the town? Her eyes glistened with tears. What do you wish would happen? Do you wish you'd never been born rich? I just want a second chance. A second chance. Her words swirled in his mind. Had he given her a second chance? He became aware of the fact that she was sitting in the cab of his truck on a day that could have been his second chance with her as well, but it wasn't. He never thought he and Nellie Larkin would be aiming for the same thing. You and me, Nellie. She turned to Dax, her eyes glittering with resolve. You know what? I'm going to do it. He pictured her robbing a bank or riding bareback at full gallop. Do what? I'm going to get a job, without my daddy's help. Wow. He hadn't expected that. And not only that, I'm going to keep it for at least 2 weeks. He slow clapped. Good for you. She narrowed her eyes. Are you teasing me? He held his hands up. I was seriously supportive. And then, I'm going to prove myself to this one stoplight town, and you, that I'm not the spoiled little rich girl everyone thinks I am. Her face glowed. If he thought her beautiful before, she was positively ravishing. He moved his hand toward her. He wanted to grasp her chin and pull her to him in a kiss. But she wasn't beaming for him. He pulled his hand back and raked his fingers through his hair. Good luck. She bit her lip. Thanks. I'll need it. He walked her to her door, where the porch light cast prisms on the floor. Nellie dug the toe of her boot on the mat. Thanks so much. For what? I didn't think I'd say this, but for a fun date. I'll admit, it went better than I thought. I mean, not because of you, but because of me. He shook his head. I'm hopeless. Until your horse decided to drown me. They laughed, and then their gazes met. Her smile faltered, as did his. Did she feel that pull, like she was the moon and he was the tide? His eyes fell to her lips. Nellie, her mom hollered from inside. Is that you? Perfect timing, dinner's ready. I'd better go in, she whispered. You'd better. She stood there for one long moment before letting herself in. For several seconds, he leaned against the doorframe, staring at the closed door, bemused. July 4th couldn't come soon enough.
Chapter 13. Nellie. Nellie drove her pink Mustang into the parking lot of the corner strip mall at the entrance of Sunny Ridge. It was the only place in town that had a stoplight. There was a Chinese restaurant on the corner, a doctor's office, a fitness gym, a realtor, a tax place, and a beauty salon. She was there for the salon. She'd never been to this one. It was decorated in purples at the front, with a purple rainbow overhead, if that made sense. Rainbow Razor was what it was called, which seemed like a brilliant oxymoron, except she doubted anyone truly strategized this on purpose. She imagined the brainstorming that went on. What should we call our beauty salon? Well, I like rainbows. Great, rainbow. Rainbow. How about razors? We cut hair. But we aren't a barber shop. Yes, but it starts with the same letter. Oh, okay then. Let's do each other's nails. Very funny, Nellie. At least they had a real job without the help of their daddy. Nellie expelled a frustrated breath. She procrastinated about coming in to apply for a job because, truth be told, she was nervous. She had told Dax she'd applied for a job before, but she didn't even apply for that babysitting gig. Her mom knew someone who was putting on the event, and her mom arranged for her to be included in basically what amounted to her and a few other girls babysitting one toddler. This time, Nellie really was on her own. How hard would it be, though, to get a job at a beauty salon? She was born to work at a salon. Why, she could even be in an ad for their services since she had such healthy hair, thanks to consistent beauty practices she started when she turned 12. Nellie tugged on her pink skirt and walked like a boss into Rainbow Razors. She noticed right away there was hair everywhere, on the floor, on the counter, on the waiting area seat. There had been a half-hearted attempt at sweeping the hair off the floor, but for the most part, the place was a mess. If she worked here, she could help tidy the place up. The mirrors looked as though they could fall any moment. They were just stand-up ones that leaned against the wall. Hopefully, they had earthquake insurance because if the big quake happened, they would be out, all those mirrors. 4 hairdressers were at their station. They were in the middle of cutting hair and looked at her curious. She vaguely recognized a couple of them. They probably had gone to the same high school as Nellie had. Now she kicked herself for not befriending more than her little clique. Nellie smiled. "Hi," she said. "Is your manager here?" The hairdresser closest to the reception area said, "I'll get her." She left Nellie feeling nervous at the reception desk. She'd never cut hair in her life. What was she thinking? But it was too late. The manager was coming out from the back. Nellie squinted at the woman. "Winnie?" she said. "Winnie Stevens?" The blonde girl gave her a wilting smile. "Hello, Nellie. Yes, it's me." Wow. Winnie had been a bit chubby on the high school cheerleading squad with Nellie, but she looked great now. Slightly overdone with the makeup, but otherwise she carried herself with style. "You look fabulous," Nellie said. Surprise flared in Winnie's eyes, followed by suspicion. "Funny. That's not what you used to say in high school." Nellie's heart sank. She honestly couldn't remember what she told Winnie in high school, but thinking back to her teenage self, she'd probably said something hurtful. "Sorry," Nellie said. "I know I said mean things back then." "Yep, you sure did," Winnie said, unsmiling. "What can I help you with?" I was wondering if you had a job opening." Winnie gaped at her. "For you?" Like her, doubts crossed Nellie's mind. "Yes, we don't have any job openings." Nellie glanced at the 2 open chairs and mirrors. "What about those spots?" "They're filled by other women, other times." "Oh, well, they aren't here all the time, obviously. Can I share spots with them?" Winnie's eyes filled with distaste. "Do you even have experience cutting hair?" "No, but I'm willing to learn." Winnie nodded slowly. "Sure. Unfortunately, you need a license and experience. I suggest you go to beauty school if you're serious about it." Beauty school would take much longer than 2 weeks. How about just someone taking care of the register, tidying up the place? Winnie shook her head. "We take turns doing that." Nellie took a deep breath. "Well, thanks anyway." Winnie hesitated, then surprised her with, "It was good seeing you again after all these years." At least Winnie seemed genuine. As Nellie walked back to her car, she worried her lip. Her ideal job, all gone, kapoof. She shouldn't have offered to cut hair right off. She could have started with cleaning the place, organized their beauty products for sale. That could have been fun. Now what? She slid into her car and thought for a moment about where else to try. There was Sylvia's family's diner, of course. No. Sylvia hated her guts. There was no way after how Nellie treated her at the auction that Sylvia's family would hire her. Nellie noticed the Chinese restaurant and brightened. Now, why didn't she even think of that, or the other businesses in this strip mall? She got out, straightened her jacket, and marched off for a new prospect. An hour and 4 resounding rejections later, she walked back to her car, defeated. Her cell phone rang. She looked at the number and saw it was Dax. She chewed on the inside of her lip. Should she answer it when she had no good news to share? She took the call. "Hello?" "Hello, sweetheart," he said, all cheery. "Sweetheart," she said, though she didn't mind completely. It actually sounded romantic. "Sorry, just practicing for the 4th. His voice rumbled with laughter. It was deep, masculine, and made her stomach go aflutter. "Cute," Her eyes gleamed in the mirror. I was wondering how the job hunt was going. Frustration ate at her. Honestly, terrible. Uh-oh. Nellie felt like a volcano so close to erupting. She wanted to vent to someone about the injustice of it all, that people actually wanted to see real job experience and qualifications. She poured this all out and then stopped herself partway. Sorry, she sniffled. Rich girl problems. Hey, it's tough finding a job nowadays. It's been so long since I've had to apply for one that I wouldn't know what to do if I were in your shoes. His words soothed her. That's nice of you to say. Anyway, I'm going to keep pounding the pavement. Hey. The word sounded like a lure, reeling her in. Yes? I was wondering if I could fix you dinner tonight. Fix dinner? She gasped. For me? Why? To take the sting out of job hunting. She leaned against her car seat, picturing Dax with his Dutch oven, serving her another great meal. His sleeves rolled up, the house smelling wonderful, and she could arrange his table. We could strategize about July 4th, I suppose, she said. Yes, of course, that's it. So, it's a yes? Yes. Great. What time should I pick you up? How about 7? Okay, 7. See you then. Chin up and all that. You've got this. Thank you. A little smile hovered over her lips. That was sweet of Dax to call her and to invite her to dinner. Her body hummed with delicious anticipation. She pulled out of the parking lot and onto Main Street, looking for other potential places of employment. There was an insurance business, another haircutting place that she didn't have the heart to check, the grocery store, 2 banks, and the hardware store. And then, of course, there was Penny's Diner, the one Sylvia's family owned, right smack dab in the middle of town. It was a long-time establishment, started by Sylvia's great-grandparents, and rumor was Sylvia was planning to buy out her parents. In the window, there was a help wanted sign. Nellie followed it with her gaze as she drove past. No, she wasn't that desperate yet. Surely Sylvia would run her out of the place. Nellie stopped at the bank first. After 15 minutes, it was clear they were looking for a full-time person who could eventually step into the shoes of the manager. At the insurance company, the guy who talked to her was so slimy she told him she wasn't interested after all. More doors slammed in her face. No one was hiring. Or they were hiring someone experienced. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Nellie was feeling pretty discouraged. She drove down Main Street once again, past Penny's Diner, and did a U-turn. What are you doing, Nellie? She muttered to herself. Sylvia's gonna eat you alive. She parked the Mustang in the mostly empty lot. The diner was always hopping with its lot, pretty full most days, but it wasn't right now, probably because they were in between meals. Wiping her clammy hands on her skirt, Nellie got out of her car and shut the door. She could smell something delicious in the air. Fried chicken? A little bell dinged as she let herself into Penny's. Then she went through a sort of glass-paneled hall toward an inner door. There was one customer eating with his back turned to the door and no one else. A server who looked about 18 with a cute blonde ponytail greeted her. For one? She asked, holding a menu. No, I'm not eating. Can I please talk to your owner? He's not here. Nellie turned. Sylvia stood at the entrance to the kitchen, her fists at her hips. Can I help you? Her eyes gazed at Nellie coolly. Hi, Sylvia, Nellie said. I saw your sign in the window and wanted to apply for the job. Sylvia's jaw dropped. You want to apply for a job? Here? Yes. Sylvia snickered. Something funny? Nellie said, feeling her hackles rise. Sylvia glanced out the window. Girl, you could buy up this place for the price of the car you drive. Well, yes, perhaps. Nellie realized how ridiculous it seemed for her to come job hunting when she drove around that car. Sylvia eyed her. You don't need this job. So what gives? I just need a job, okay? Sylvia's eyes narrowed. I don't get it. The other day you practically insulted me at the auction. Said you had me beat at my income and bid on Dax out of spite. And then here you are, badgering me for a job? Nellie bristled. You know, I thought I could count on being treated decently here, knowing your dad. He could at least be polite to me. She took a deep breath. I'm sorry about the auction. Had I known I was bidding on Dax, I'd have given him up for you, but I didn't have my glasses on, so I got stuck with him. Sylvia folded her arms across her chest. Anyway, have a nice day. Nellie marched across the restaurant, her heels clicking on the black and white tile. Wait! Nellie stopped and turned. Sylvia was standing there looking uncertain. We could use another hand, but I honestly don't know if this is a good fit for you. It's just part-time hours, lots of standing, and it can get pretty crazy. Part-time is good with me, Nellie said, her hopes rising. You'll have to talk to my dad. He gets to give the final say. Of course. Come back at 4. He'll be here then. Thanks. They gave each other a tentative smile. Nellie paused at the door and turned. Do you like Dax Ellison? Romantically? Sylvia shook her head. Nah, I was just trying to help raise money for the service circle. Her gaze narrowed. Do you? No, Nellie said quickly. I was just curious. See you in a bit.
Chapter 14. Dax. Dax added a dash of pepper to the roast. He took a sliver of a bite and smiled. It was just the right amount of moistness and flavor. He went back inside and glanced at the clock. Time to pick Nellie up. He walked to the door and looked at his reflection in the mirror. Not bad for a 26-year-old cowboy. He wondered if Nellie would even notice that he got a haircut today. Not that he had gotten one for her. He eased his hat on his head and drove his truck over to the Larkins. The light was on, illuminating their spacious porch. He walked up and rang the bell. To his surprise, the door was flung open, and out came Nellie. She ran up to him and held his hands. His heart raced at her touch. He was floored. He didn't expect that. Her eyes were shining, and he could feel her happiness oozing from every pore. Hey, he said, squeezing her hands. Glad someone is happy to see me. She pulled away and covered her mouth with a hand. I got a job. She was so cute. Any moment she looked like she would break out into one of those musical numbers. High five, he said, and she slapped his hand. Where? Penny's Diner. I don't think Sylvia wanted to hire me, but her dad overruled her. They started walking to his truck, and he got behind the wheel after helping her in. Sylvia and Nestor are good people. She studied his profile. Especially Sylvia, huh? He frowned. What do you mean? Nothing. He circled the driveway and headed to his place. She sighed. They must have been desperate. You sell yourself short, sweetheart. He caught himself. Nellie. He felt her eyes on his profile. Hey, did you get a haircut? She asked. Yep. I like it. She touched his nape and then bit her lip as though she thought better of it. Such a small caress, but pleasure coursed through him. When do you start? He asked. Tomorrow. What about the 4th? Will you have to work then? He braced himself for disappointment. That's the nice thing. Sylvia's dad is the coolest person. I told him I had family stuff that day and he said I didn't have to work then. Nice. They reached Dax's place. He'd left lights on so that it would look more inviting when he brought her over. Wryly, he observed that the light just accentuated the drabness of his place. He really couldn't hold a candle to what Nellie had, so he may as well not try. They got out of the truck and walked up to the porch where Bub raised his head. Hey, Bub, Nellie said. I got a job today. Bub gave her an unexcited response, but maybe he was just overwhelmed and speechless. Dax opened the front door for Nellie and watched her reaction. Dax Ellison, she squealed. You spiffed up this place. Yep. I decided the pigsty didn't belong to the inside of my house. That was some work you did. This place had saddles all over. I really had room in my workshop in the back. I just got lazy over time. I would work on a saddle inside and eat as I did it. Soon I slept in snatches while I waited for glue to dry. But after you came over and I saw how it might look to an outsider, I decided I needed to clean up. If my mama could have seen the house, I think she would have paddled my behind with a broom." Nellie giggled. "I couldn't see your sweet mom doing that. She was the nicest person. I still remember when she headed up the service circle." Dax didn't answer, thinking of his sweet mother, missing her something fierce. "Sorry," she said, touching his sleeve. "I didn't mean to make you sad." Her eyes were filled with concern. Her touch felt good. He covered her hand with his. "Thanks." Her eyes widened. Did she feel that too? That amazing current as their hands touched? She pulled out of his grasp and gave him a shy smile. "So, anyway," he said, clearing his throat, "dinner's pretty much ready, so shall we?" As Nellie walked into the kitchen, Dax noticed her eyes went to the sink, now clear of dishes. The trash had been taken out and the floor had even been swept. "Wow," she said. "Even your kitchen got a makeover." I finally decided it was time to throw stuff away. She glanced at the plain, chipped table. "You need me to set out the plates?" she offered. "Do you mind? I need to bring the meat in from the smoker." "Sure, where's everything?" After he showed her, he went to get the roast. When he came back in, she had already set the table, with a cloth even. "Where'd you get that?" he asked. "From the cupboard over there." She pointed at the last cupboard that he hadn't cracked open in a while. "Funny. I've lived here forever and I didn't even know that existed." "There's plenty of lovely stuff there. Your mom must have collected it." "Now that you say that, I guess it is vaguely familiar." He admired her handiwork, plain but sturdy white plates and glasses on the rose-colored tablecloth. "Very nice." "Thanks." "I bet you're excited to set tables at Penny's." She smiled. "It's nothing fancy, but yes, I'll get to do that all day." Her excitement was contagious. They washed up, said grace, and dug into the fine meal, if he could say so himself, topped with dessert at the end, an apple pie. "Did you make this, Dax?" she asked, digging into the pie with relish. Sunnyway did." "That's okay. No one can be that perfect." He gazed at her. "Did you just call me perfect?" She pointed at her bulging cheek. "Can't talk." But he still looked at her suspiciously as her cheeks reddened. "I didn't say you were perfect, but you're near perfect." "Go on." Nellie rolled her eyes. "Well, you cook like a dream, and you're polite, you don't smell, and you can clean house." "Score." He pumped his fist. They smiled at each other. Dax felt butterflies in his stomach. Was that love, or just too much apple pie? "So, boss," he said, brushing the pie crust crumbs off his stubble. "What's the game plan for the 4th? Steer clear of Aunt Edna at any costs." "Aunt Edna, no." "Why?" "Because she will talk your ear off, and if we're together, I will have to hear it all." "Shouldn't I meet your parents formally?" She cocked her head. "That would be a good idea. Maybe tonight when you drop me off? We'll do a quick intro, if they're still up. I would hate for it to be so public. They'll grill you and it won't be pretty." "Okay." "You'll meet all my aunts and uncles with the corresponding cousins. The girl cousins will all try to flirt with you. The boy cousins will be too busy eating." "What about, you know?" Her eyes took him in. "What?" "Holding hands? Kissing?" She looked like a deer in headlights. "What about it?" "Don't you think it'd be more convincing to your Gram if we at least hold hands?" "No, that's not necessary," she said in a hurry. "Gram didn't even hold hands until her honeymoon. I'm sure she won't expect us to do any of that." The apple pie in Dax's stomach suddenly felt heavy. "Fair enough, but for sure no kissing?" She glanced at his mouth and he suddenly wanted to taste apple pie on her lips. I I don't see why we'd need to, she said, panic in her voice. It's not like people in relationships kiss in public all the time. Again, I am just thinking of things to make your Graham happy. Graham doesn't have good eyesight anyway. That's settled then. Steer clear of the gabbers, flirt with the cousins. What? I didn't say that. It's all harmless, really. I'm just going to be friendly. While we're on female cousins, do not, I repeat, do not flirt with Joanna or she'll stalk you. Joanna. Check. So, no hand-holding, no kissing. His gaze fell to her mouth. He wanted to kiss her very much. But he got the message loud and clear. She would make the rounds with him as a trophy boyfriend. Without warning, he got kind of annoyed. Standing up, he started clearing. She reached up and touched his arm. Thanks for doing this one family thing for my Graham's sake. Was he really doing it for Graham's sake? Or for his? Sure thing. Whatever makes her happy. Chapter 15. Dax. Dax parked his truck in the Larkin driveway and turned to Nellie. She looked beautiful, and he ached to hold her. Are you excited about your first day of work tomorrow? She nodded. And scared, to be honest. I bet you'll do great. You think? I've never done anything like this before. It's just like riding a bike or driving. It's scary as can be, but with practice, you'll get better. I wanted to thank you, she said. I would never have done this if you hadn't questioned my job status. I knew you had it in you to be like the rest of us commoners. She stuck her tongue out, and it was all he could do not to pull her to him. They fell silent. He was faced toward her, and she was turned forward. Thanks for joining me for dinner, he said. Thanks for cooking, she smiled. When he didn't say anything, she glanced at her house. Do you have to go already? He said, embarrassed that he might have come across as needy, hopelessly in love. Her gaze flicked toward him. Was that regret in her expression? Well, it's late, she said, and I have an early start tomorrow. Sure. He got out of his side and opened her door. He stuffed his hands in his pockets and they walked kind of slow to the front porch. You still up to meeting my folks? She asked. He nodded. Are you going to tell them we're dating? She thought for a minute. I probably should. Otherwise they would ask the hard questions at the 4th of July party in front of everyone. Okay. She opened the door and called out, Mom? Daddy? She motioned for him to come in. So, this was the inner sanctum. The family room was 2 stories high, decorated in high-end Western. There was welded decor, old lanterns, leather couches, and black wrought iron accents. Mounted hunting trophies, including a bison and moose, covered one wall. Nellie's parents came down the stairs together. Mom, Daddy, I want you to meet Dax, my boyfriend. Dax, my mom Rita, and my daddy Leroy. You're... Oh! Rita took the steps at a faster clip. Hello, Dax. She was beautiful, a paler version of her daughter, more strawberry blonde than true redhead. She didn't shake hands with Dax, just smiled politely, secretly casing him out, he was sure. Dax had seen her daddy around town and in community meetings. Leroy Larkin was a tall, big-boned fella in his big buckled jeans, with dark hair and a big mustache. His hand swallowed Dax's as he pumped it up and down, looking as jolly as a pallbearer. Son, he said, you treating my daughter well? Yes, sir, Dax said, standing even straighter if he could. Because if you don't... He glared at Dax. Don't worry, sir. I'm respectful and I even cook for her. Nellie's daddy peppered Dax with more and more questions until Dax wondered if he would have to produce his driver's license or get his fingerprints taken. Leroy Larkin finally nodded, seemingly satisfied. I'll leave you young folks to stay up. I'm too old to keep carousing into dawn. It was 9 o'clock. Her mom made small talk for a few minutes, and then she too drifted upstairs, leaving them alone in the family room. Dax walked over to the black grand piano. You play? I used to. She joined him. I stopped lessons a while back. Do you play an instrument? I took up guitar in high school, but stopped. One of my sisters borrowed my guitar, and I never bothered to ask her for it back. I know a song, she said. She slid onto the bench, and he sat beside her. The piano was shiny, dust-free. They probably hired a housekeeper to keep the place looking clean. Nellie played and sang a song about a cowgirl holding up a wagon and stealing a cowboy's heart. By the time she was done hamming it up, she and Dax busted out laughing. Your turn, she said. Dax stretched his fingers, put them on the keys, and played a nonsensical song. After the last jarring note died down, she giggled and covered the keys, leaning against the polished lid with her elbow. She looked dreamy, beautiful. He yearned to slide even closer and tip her lips to his. I've been thinking, she said. Could this be it? Could she be starting to have feelings for him? Yes? He waited with bated breath. I'd asked you before, but could you please make a saddle for my daddy? He's turning 60 and I wanted to get something special for him. He averted his face to hide his disappointment. What's your budget? You told me 10 grand. Is that right for a good one? Yes. Okay. Just like that. He arched an eyebrow. I know you're rich and everything, but you have that kind of money? Yes. When do you need it by? His birthday's in 2 weeks. I can't customize one that fast from scratch, but I could finish one that I have now and sell you that. Could you? Her eyes brightened. That would be great. I know you're good for your word, but I would need half down. All right. Just curious, you simply have this kind of cash lying around for saddles? I have some money I've saved up for my earnings. That still leaves me enough that I can do what I've been planning and plotting for a while now. And what is that? Moving out? She looked away. Living on my own. I can't live on my parents' money forever. She studied him as though gauging his reaction. Dax blinked. Nellie would be moving away just when he'd connected with her again? Where would you move to? I've been thinking back east. I have some relatives in the D.C. area. I could work for a senator's office or something. He pictured her going to work in a sharp and attractive tailored suit, turning heads in a subway. A sharp pang of jealousy spread across his chest. She twirled her hair on a finger. Maybe I could work for Congressman Gabe Brown. Now, why would you move all the way across the country? She was thoughtful for a moment, her expression soft. Maybe I want to reinvent myself. Go somewhere no one knows me. I confirmed that today while applying for jobs. As soon as they made the connection between me and my daddy, their attitude changed. Or it was someone like Winnie from high school. Remember her? Vaguely. Did you know she runs that beauty salon off Main Street in that strip mall? I had no idea. She doesn't like me from high school. I can't blame her. I wasn't very nice. What if people gave you a second chance right here in Sunny Ridge? Would you stay? Her green eyes considered him, thoughtful. You think they will? I did. Well, that's different, she said. How so? Her voice was soft. You didn't know any better, she half teased. He smiled and then sobered. You should stay. Give Sunny Ridge a chance. She blinked and then looked away. Maybe leaving is how I'll find myself. No more of this poor little rich girl stuff. Maybe you have everything you need right here." When she gave him a questioning glance, he said, "If you left, you would be like me with no family in Sunny Ridge. That's just temporary, right?" A little frown formed between her brow. "Aren't your sisters coming back?" "Who knows? One of them is dating someone seriously. Anyway, I admire your wanting to move away from family, but there isn't a day that passes that I don't think about mine." "Why haven't you married, Dax?" She probed him with her gaze. He could drown in her green eyes. "I was holding out for the right girl, and then I guess one day I woke up and I was a lot older. All the cute girls had been taken." She raised an eyebrow. "Should I be offended by that?" "All but one of the cute girls," he corrected himself. "How about you? Why haven't you married?" "You want the honest truth?" "Sure." "I think guys are intimidated either by me or my daddy." "I can see that. Dax certainly was." "And I meant it when I talked about Tim. I don't like pushovers. I need a man who's my equal." Could he be that man for Nellie? In the ensuing silence, Dax was a high school kid again, asking her to the Valentine's dance, bracing for her rejection. "Anyway," he said, "as for me, I'm in a good place, turning into a crusty old bachelor. I'll keep making my saddles and taking care of my cattle. If a girl comes along, I'll be ready." "We should set each other up with blind dates," she said. "Yeah, good idea." He smiled, but the thought of being on a double date with a different girl while Nellie was on a blind date with someone else depressed him. He waited a beat in case she had this brilliant thought that maybe they should date each other for real, but when that didn't come, he got to his feet. "I'd better head out, let you get your beauty rest." She stood and walked him to the door. Right before they got there, he remembered he needed to tell her something and turned quickly. She didn't stop and ran straight into him. His arms went around her instinctively, and he gazed intently at her rosy lips. A sweet, smoky thread of longing unspooled inside him. She stared at him, her eyes round. He would have kissed her, but her parents might just be a step away. "Good luck tomorrow," he said, and then took himself off into the dark night without waiting for her answer.
Chapter 16. Nellie. Nellie drove her Mustang to her first day of work and smoothed her hair she'd put back into a simple chignon. Sylvia had suggested that she put her hair up for hygienic purposes, which Nellie wholeheartedly agreed with. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror and noted how bright her eyes were. Could they have something to do with a certain cowboy named Dax? Maybe, not that she'd admit it to anyone. Last night was one of the funnest dates she'd been on in a long time. But the end was all confusing. One moment, Dax looked like he wanted to kiss her. Another moment, he was hightailing it out of there like a gopher being chased down its hole. If he'd kissed her, she wouldn't have minded. But she wasn't a girl to initiate that sort of thing. A kiss had to be taken properly by a cowboy. She blew out a breath and focused on the day. She was working a real job for the first time and didn't have time to daydream. Sylvia's dad, Nestor, greeted her at the entrance. "Welcome, Nellie," Nestor said, grinning. He was in his 60s with a quick smile, unlike his daughter, who usually looked serious. Nellie did a quick look around and couldn't see Sylvia. Good. Sylvia made her nervous. Nestor handed Nellie an apron and showed her around the restaurant. By 11 in the morning, which was opening time, she felt like she at least knew where most everything was and what was expected. Sylvia arrived looking frazzled. She stopped short at the sight of Nellie and then breathed again. "Oh, that's right," she said. "You work here now." And then she walked at a fast clip to the little office in the back. "Yep," Nellie said. "Thanks for the warm welcome." Her first customer was an easy one. It was a single gentleman who wanted the special, which was an open-faced turkey roast. He wanted refills of his coffee and also a take-home container. Closer to noon, the place started hopping. Between her and 4 other servers, they were zipping back and forth. Nellie messed up a few times, forgetting which ones were her table and getting the wrong soda for people. Nestor just gently reminded her, but Sylvia made sure to announce from the rooftops that she goofed. "Nellie, table 6 got the wrong order. Fix it." "Nellie, table 1 is still waiting on their rolls." "Nellie, table 2 needs their order taken." No matter how hard she tried, Nellie still managed to flub something. Frankly, after 2 hours, the novelty wore off and she was about ready to quit. Or at least take a break in the back somewhere and have a good cry. "Nellie, you have a customer at table 4. No time to cry. It would have to wait. She put a weary hand to her hair, which had sagged in all the heat of the kitchen. Her lipstick had long since faded. Her makeup melted, and she had multiple stains on her apron. Her eyes immediately focused on a man sitting in a booth. Table 4. Dax Ellison. Great. She was already flustered. He was just going to make it worse. He looked up from the menu and did a double take. "Whoa. Hi, Nellie." She gave him a nervous smile. "Hi." He leaned back, pinning her with those blue eyes. His muscles rippled under a shirt that fit him just right. When he smiled, excitement swirled in her chest. "I was hoping to run into you," he said. "What a bonus. You're even my server." "Why?" she asked lightly. "To make fun of me?" If he sassed her, she would reach her breaking point. "No, to congratulate you." "Oh, well, thanks. I'm sure I look like a mess." His eyes lingered over her face, her apron, and back to her eyes. "You look cute." Her cheeks warmed. "Thanks. What can I get you to drink?" He leaned forward. "Now that you have infiltrated the inner circle, can you tell me why you ask for a drink order first before taking the full one?" "It's so your customers have more time to look over the menu." "Ah, brilliant. I'll have a water then." "With or without a lemon slice?" "Without." She put her little order pad in her apron pocket. "Be right back with your drink." She sensed him watching her as she left the table for the kitchen. In the kitchen, she paused, trying to calm her breath and heart. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in a little mirror by the kitchen sink. "You look cute." She actually did look cute. In a blousy way, like she'd been out in the sun for a bit, pink in the cheeks from all the exertion of getting everyone's orders. As she smiled to herself, she realized Sylvia was watching her. Nellie snapped out of her thoughts and made her way to the soda fountain. Back out she went to take Dax his water. "What'll you have?" she said. "What do you recommend?" His eyes danced. "Is this your first time here?" she asked, slightly annoyed. "No, but it's my first time having you for my server." "Well, all day I have had orders for the fish and chips, so I would recommend that. But if you want to be healthier, I suggest the chicken salad." He rubbed the scruff on his jaw. She stared at him, transfixed at the gesture, and then bent her head over her little notepad once again. "I've never thought about the salad, to be honest," he said. "I'll try that today." "Okay." She took his menu and their fingers brushed, making her suck her breath in. He stared at her and then smiled. When she brought him his salad, he took a bite and made a thumbs-up sign, his cheek bulging. "Wow, this is great." "Didn't I tell you?" She put a hand on her waist. He took another bite. "Seriously, I have never had this here before. Thanks for suggesting it. You should try the ribs next time. I took an order out and it looked good." "Oh, I've had that one." He cocked his head. "Are you working here full-time then?" "Just a full first day to make up for tomorrow, but otherwise part-time." "You look like a pro." Her face warmed with pleasure. She left him digging into his salad. After checking on him a couple more times, she noticed him sliding out of his booth while she was taking another table's order. Tamping down her disappointment that he didn't even say goodbye, she finished taking the order and went over to clear his spot. He had left a $20 tip and a note on the back of his ticket. "Thanks for the wonderful service. I loves the chicken. You are doing an awesome job. See you tomorrow." He had drawn a heart after it. With a smile, she tucked the note in her pocket. At the end of the day, she helped clean up and hung up her apron just as Sylvia was counting out the money. Sylvia pushed the cash register shut with a little ding. "Hey, good job today," Sylvia said. "Thanks. Is your dad still around?" Sylvia looked at her curiously. "No, why? I just wanted to thank him too. He's home with my mom." Sylvia hesitated. "She has cancer." "Oh," Nellie's face fell. "I'm sorry to hear that." "It's okay. They caught it early on, thank goodness, but she's been having to have treatments done and all, and that's been super hard for her." "I can see that. I hope she fights it off." Sylvia nodded and swallowed, worry in her eyes. "I hope so too. Well, good night." As Nellie walked to her car, she thought of Mrs. Garcia, Sylvia's mom. Suddenly, Nellie's petty problems, like bringing a boyfriend to her family's July 4th party, seemed like nothing.
Chapter 17. Dax. At 9 the next day, Dax walked up to Nellie's front porch, feeling as nervous as a flighty stallion. He really wasn't used to being around rich folk, let alone a whole clan of them. It was one thing to visit with Nellie, he was starting to get the hang of that, but it was another to visit with a whole bunch of Nellies. The Larkin driveway was crammed with so many cars that Dax had to squeeze his truck along the dirt road fronting their property. Nellie opened the door with a smile. Boy, was she a sight. She was wearing a white blouse and a denim skirt, her red hair swept back from her face with a cute tied-up bandana as a hairband. Dax glanced down at his blue shirt and was glad he was at least somewhat color-coordinated. "Happy 4th, she said, grabbing his hand and pulling him into the house. She said no hand-holding, but he wasn't going to protest. He straightened his hat and let her lead him. She made the rounds with a bunch of people sitting in the family room. Several younger cousins, Joanna with red pouty lips, Aunt Edna, more aunts and an uncle, friends and babies. He didn't even try remembering their names. The only one that really mattered was Mrs. Larkin, Nellie's gram. She sat in a wheelchair at the end of one of the couches. "Hello again, young man," she greeted Dax. "Happy 4th, Gram," he said. Beside him, Nellie squeezed his hand. He squeezed her hand back. "Everyone," Gram announced, "this is Nellie's boyfriend." Nellie's hand squeezed his like Morse code. It probably stood for something like SOS. Graham reached up and pinched Nellie's cheek. "It makes me happy to see you happy," Graham said. Dax relinquished his hold of Nellie's hand and draped his arm around her waist as they'd practiced at the lake. "I love making Nellie happy." Nellie turned besotted eyes to him. Whoa, she was a good actress. "Come and join my team, Nellie," one of the cousins said. Still leaning into Dax's arm, Nellie asked, "What are you playing?" "Speed." "Dax and I will," Nellie said, a question in her eyes as she turned to him. "Want to?" "Sure." They sat on the couch, crammed with people, squeezing so that Nellie practically sat on Dax's lap. She was turned away from him, kind of leaning her back against his chest. Dax couldn't follow the explanation for the game. His nearness to Nellie was messing with his brain. "You play and I'll watch," he said into her ear. She turned and glanced at him through her lashes. He caught a whiff of her perfume. "No cheating," one of her cousins said. There were at least a dozen people playing this game, which involved, as far as Dax could tell, multiple card decks played like solitaire. In a group. It was an insane scene of card slapping and smack talking. Nellie, his Nellie for the day, won a round or two. Dax felt like a proud fan. Not that he helped or anything, but surely holding her close and whispering encouragement in her ear helped. When the game was done and everyone was just drinking iced drinks and gossiping about family, Nellie didn't move away. Dax was in Nellie heaven. He could get used to this. Too bad this was just temporary, not to mention fake. If it were real, How much more amazing could it be? "Parade time!" someone shouted, and everyone started to file out to the back of the house. Nellie stood and pulled Dax to his feet. "What's going on?" Dax asked, disappointed that the cuddling apparently wasn't going to continue. Nellie swiveled and jerked her head toward the back. "Come on, we'll watch the parade from the balcony." So that's where Dax spent the next hour, watching the Sunny Ridge Parade, looking down upon the parade route from the back of the Larkin mansion. It was the only section of the parade that went through a smaller street than Main Street. Apparently, wink wink, because of Leroy Larkin's influence. Dax missed holding Nellie like he had during the card game, but with the whole family squished together on the balcony, there wasn't much choice but for him to stand behind her, his arms around her waist once again. It was a tough job, but someone had to do it. Nellie didn't object, so... "How long have you and Nellie been dating?" Aunt Edna asked Dax over the applause in the marching band. "Just a few days." She waggled her eyebrows. "Was it love at first sight?" "I don't know about her," he said truthfully, "but it was for me." "How romantic." Nellie glanced around, her eyes shining. She'd obviously been listening, but Dax didn't mind. His heart pounded. The intersection of fact and fiction was starting to blur, and he didn't care if Nellie heard it. Not today, anyway. "Excuse us, Aunt Edna," Nellie said, pulling him away from the balcony and leading him down the steps so they were standing at the curb with other parade-goers. "I want candy," she said, "and giveaways." And she wasn't kidding. When the fire department came around throwing taffy, Nellie was right there along with the little kids, picking up candy off the road like a vacuum. When a realtor threw a stuffed rabbit, Nellie jumped up and down, trying to catch the realtor's attention. The rabbit sailed overhead, with Dax catching it easily. "Mine," Nellie said, giggling as she wrapped her arms around his waist. Dax snagged her close with one arm and kept the bunny hoisted, barely out of her reach. "You can have it for a kiss." Nellie stared at his mouth, hers curving up in a smile. She got on her tippy toes and slanted her lips across his. It was a quick movement, like the striking of a match. A small flame that flared and teased, leaving a scorched aftermath. She pulled back, her eyes dark and stormy like the sea, watching his reaction. Not fair. He wanted more. His blood raced. If they were alone, he would have embraced her fully, kissing her until she was weak in his arms. When he handed her the bunny, she pressed it against her cheek, looking adorable. She kissed it, too, making Dax wish he was a bunny.
Chapter 18. Nellie. From the buffet table, Nellie watched Dax interact with her family. He was fitting in so well. This was not going as planned. Sure, they seemed to be fooling everyone. Graham was happy in the corner. Aunt Edna kept her interrogation to a minimum. Her cousins flirted, as predicted, but Dax seemed to have eyes only for Nellie. His glance skidded over to her once again, and she pretended to busy herself at dishing up potato salad. What would happen to them after today? The deal was that they would fake the 4th, and then they would part ways. Dax seemed pretty adamant about that, and Nellie thought it was a good idea too. Until today. Every touch, every smile, every glance. Nellie couldn't think straight. She felt like she was in a bubble of pleasure. Dax was attentive, sweet, and played her boyfriend to the hilt. And of course, there was that kiss. She had broken her own rule, initiating it, although, for the record, Dax had suggested the trade for the stuffed animal that she ended up giving to a younger cousin. "Hey!" Dax's voice startled her. He had walked over to stand beside her at the buffet. "Hi." I didn't see this earlier," he said, taking a deviled egg off her plate. "Dax Ellison," she scolded. "That was rude." He winked as he chewed. And she couldn't really be mad at him. Besides, there was something oddly appropriate about him eating off her plate. He was her boyfriend, after all. He picked up another deviled egg from the serving plate. She was sure he was going to keep gorging himself. Instead, he offered it to Nellie. She stared at it and then took a bite. As she licked the egg off the side of her lip, his gaze intensified. "More?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes not leaving his. He popped the last bit in her mouth, his finger trailing her bottom lip. "Oi." Here are our lovers," Aunt Edna twittered. "You two are so adorable." "Thanks, Aunt Edna," Nellie said, not meeting Dax's gaze. By the time dinner and after dinner wrapped up, the sun was setting. Those who came to the Larkin party grabbed their blankets from their cars and moseyed on over to City Park, which was about a 5-minute walk from the house. Already, City Park was covered with blankets and lawn chairs, families with little kids wearing glow sticks, babies crawling on the grass, and young punks hawking cold water and candy. Nellie had 2 quilts, and Dax offered to carry one. She spread one on the grass by a tree so they could lean against it and save the other one in case it got chilly. As the sun lowered, the temperature dropped slightly, not uncomfortably so, but enough to be nippy. She shook the extra quilt and covered her legs. "Here," Dax said, helping her spread the blue quilt. "Thank you," she murmured. Some of Nellie's younger cousins came over and recruited Dax to be on their tag team. Soon, tag turned into horseback rides. Who was laughing the loudest? Nellie couldn't decide between Dax and the kids. A warm feeling spread throughout her body, watching Dax play like a little boy. She could see him being a great dad someday to his kids. "He's a keeper," Graham's voice carried to Nellie from her wheelchair. Nellie got up, wrapping the blanket around her, and knelt beside Graham. "You think?" "Sure. He's great with the kids." "Yes, he is. And he's great with you." Nellie didn't answer. Graham spoke again. "He seems to care a lot about you." "He does?" "If you can't tell, you need your eyes checked, Missy." "Actually, I probably do need better contacts." Graham patted her hand. "Now I can die happy." Nellie swallowed the lump in her throat. "Graham, you shouldn't say that." "Probably not." Graham's eyes gleamed as she watched the family gather together. "But I expect you to carry on after me." She patted Nellie's cheek. "Stay feisty." Nellie sniffled. "Yes, Graham. You can be sure I will." It was time to get ready for the fireworks show. The sun had set and glow sticks seemed to float around. Nellie got up and made her way over to the quilt just as Dax was returning too. "Did they break the Mustang?" she asked. He grinned. Sure felt like it." Nellie stared at his handsome mug, her heart pounding painfully. After tonight, they would go back to being frenemies. She kind of missed the banter they had, but she just might miss this new kind of friendship more. He sat on the blanket with his back to the tree. "Want to lean against me?" he asked. His eyes gleamed in the deepening darkness. She really ought to put some distance between them, now, before she continued to fall for him down a hopeless path. But today, he was her boyfriend, and she could play along too. She sat between his legs, and after a moment of surprise, his brawny arms pulled her against him. He linked his hands with hers and nuzzled her neck. The whole time, her body felt as though it would combust from all the sensations. This was insane, and yet it felt so right. It was dark. No one could see them, and even if they did, her family had accepted Dax. Nothing would be amiss with them cuddling under the quilt while waiting for the fireworks show. She turned so her cheek rested against his broad chest, and he unlinked one hand to caress the side of her face. She raised her eyes to his. She could stay lost in them. If this was play acting, let the play go on forever. The first firework went off, to the oohs and ahs of the crowd. Nellie turned so she could watch the sky show, but the pyrotechnics paled compared to what was going on with her body in Dax's embrace. His arms tightened around her as he kissed the top of her head. Each explosion punctuated the beating of her heart, competing with the thrill of his fingers threading themselves through her hair and then down her arm, back to linking with her fingers. As the fireworks worked themselves into their grand finale, Nellie's heart raced. Dax raised his hand and tipped her chin, so she faced him, his gaze intent on her lips. Her eyes fluttered shut. At the touch of his lips on hers, he set off their own grand, bombastic fireworks show. She realized she had been waiting for this moment all day, and now that it was happening, she couldn't get enough. He was starved for a kiss, as she was. She strained to get closer to him, to angle deeper, and he groaned softly. Applause broke out around them, and Nellie pushed away, unsteady. Under her fingers spread on his chest, she could feel his heart pounding like hers. Dax lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it.
Chapter 19. Dax. Dax walked Nellie to her front door in silence. For one day, he finally discovered what it would be like to possess Nellie Larkin, and now it was over. They didn't touch, though all his senses were acutely aware of her walking beside him. All he needed to do was to reach over, and she could be in his arms again. But that wasn't the deal. The deal was one day of faking it for the family. One long, crazy, amazing day, down to their explosive kiss. For as long as he lived, he would remember it. After this, they would be back to what, he wasn't sure. Back to the wall he was good at putting up so she couldn't reject him again. Back to her being a spoiled girl who both exasperated and fascinated him. Back to distant hellos at the grocery store. Maybe by the next Cowboy auction, she'd have a ring on her finger, and it wouldn't be from him. Most of the family had already left. A few stalwart partygoers stayed on. Through the frosted glass of the front door, people moved in indistinct shapes. If anyone came out, they would run into Dax and Nellie, stop there in awkward silence. "Thank you so much," Nellie said. "We made Graham happy today." It was always about making Graham happy. He dug the tip of his boot into the husk doormat. "You're welcome." He gave her a wry smile. "I'll be watching you, kid. Don't forget, you owe me 2 weeks at the job." "And if I don't?" she sassed him. He could have pushed for a bet. Another date, another kiss, another chance. Especially with this Nellie he'd rediscovered. Beautiful as always, and sweet, soft, caring, fun. The words died in his throat. He had been brave about a lot of things in his life, but declaring himself to Nellie terrified him. She said, "About my daddy's saddle." "Uh-huh." "Are we on track for you to finish one?" "Yep." "I can get you the money." "I know where you live," he smiled. She smiled back. "I guess this is it," she said. "It doesn't have to be." "I suppose," he said. Her eyes searched his. Then she flashed him that good old Nellie smile, like she hadn't a care in the world, though the expression in her eyes seemed brittle. "See you around, Cowboy." She opened the door and walked in the house. As the door closed, Dax stood there for a long moment. He pressed a hand on the door to steady himself as she broke his heart in two, yet again.
Chapter 20. Nellie. Nellie was grateful for work the next day. Being hungover from Dax Ellison was tough. She dreamed of him the night before. He was at her doorstep, delivering the saddle she'd used on Misty. She took it from him with a smile, but her parents were watching, so she invited him for a cool drink of lemonade. He remained standing the entire time, just talking to her parents, not sparing Nellie a glance. She willed him to look at her, but he refused to do so. Finally, when it was time for him to go, Nellie disappeared into thin air. She tried to get his attention, but he didn't, or wouldn't, hear. She woke up sad and heartsick. She had known this day was coming, but she hadn't expected it to leave such a huge hole in her heart. Getting dressed was a chore. The diner had a uniform, black jeans, black shirt, and that apron. By the time she was done and looking at her reflection in the mirror, she thought she looked ready for a funeral, Even her flaming red hair seemed unusually subdued. As she got to the diner parking lot, she saw the familiar brown truck, and her heart thudded in painful strokes. She put a hand to her hair and remembered her makeup. Maybe she should have fixed herself up a bit better and applied more than just mascara and lip gloss. But it was too late. Besides, why should it matter? It wasn't like she had to impress Dax or anything now that their fake relationship was over. Entering the diner, she spotted Dax across the dining area, standing with his back turned to her and talking to someone. He wore his cowboy hat and a white shirt tucked in those jeans. After a moment, he shifted angles, and Nellie could see that he was talking, no, flirting, with Sylvia. Nellie's chest flared with jealousy. Just the day after, whatever it was they had, and he was already off scoping other girls? Maybe he was trying to get a real date now that he was off the hook for his fake one. Trying to tamp down her pain, she headed for the lockers and put her purse away. With trembling hands, she pulled the apron over her head and tied it in the back. She walked over to the front counter to be ready for the next customer when Dax turned around with an arm over Sylvia's shoulder. Their heads were close together, and their expressions were tender. Nellie blinked back tears and glanced at the tray in her hand, then back at the couple. She had planned on being brave and maybe even saying hi to Dax, but there was no need now. She wished she could disappear. But it was too late. He raised his head and saw her. He stared at her for a few seconds, his forehead furrowed with concern, maybe regretting already that he'd just wasted the day before with the wrong girl. She shuddered her expression to hide the ache she felt inside. Casually, he undraped his arm from Sylvia and headed Nellie's direction. She couldn't talk to him right then without falling apart. Panicking, Nellie swiveled at her heels and busied herself with wiping down the sink area. "I've already done that," Corinne, one of the servers, said. "Oh," Nellie said, her voice sounding hoarse to her ears. "Okay, no wonder it's so clean." She winced at her lame words. Dax spoke to someone at the counter. Nellie could hear his voice, deep and low, like a country singer's. If she waited long enough, he would walk out of the diner and past the window where she stood. Then she could watch him before bustling onto the tables. "Hey, Nellie," Dax said. Moment of truth. She took a deep breath and turned. All the longing from last night flooded her. She was drowning in his gaze. For 1 second, she remembered his kiss on the blanket. Fireworks. All that had been fake, she reminded herself. "Hey," she said, unable to manage a smile. He didn't say anything, just had this puppy dog look as though to apologize that he'd obviously moved on to Sylvia. They were too far apart to talk, especially with the others around them. Sylvia had come back into the prep area. He was here to see Sylvia anyway. Nellie turned back to the sink, hurting. "Nellie, table 6 is ready," Corinne said. "Sure." She pushed off the counter and fished her notebook and pen from her apron. She ducked her head so she didn't have to look at Dax. As she passed him, he took a step forward, his hand shooting out and touching her arm. "How are you?" he asked, his eyes anxious. Up close, she could see his rough stubble and remembered how it felt against her cheek, her lips. Did he have to affect her that way? She moved so she wasn't within his reach. "I'm fine," she said through gritted teeth. "Excuse me, but I need to get a table." "Sure, I was just—" She lifted her chin, giving him a haughty stare, like the old Nellie, before she made the huge mistake of falling for him. She braced herself for his revelation that he was dating Sylvia after all. His glance took in her expression, uncertainty clouding his face. Never mind." Just as well. She walked on without looking back.
Chapter 21. Dax. Well, so much for his pipe dream. Dax watched Nellie walk on past, her hips swaying slightly, and wrenched his gaze away. As much as he told himself it was no good to even try to make something out of yesterday, a part of him was foolish enough to try. He'd come as soon as he knew the diner was open, disappointed that her pink Mustang wasn't there yet. And then, while he was comforting Sylvia about her mother, he turned, his stomach flipping at the sight of Nellie's beautiful red hair in her cute waitress uniform. The night before, he'd stayed up reliving their kiss. He woke aching to hold her again, wishing he could call her, even just to hear her voice. In the middle of making her daddy saddle, he decided to be brave and go to the diner just to say hi. But seeing her at the diner, he knew it would not be enough. He had fallen head over heels in love. He wanted to have a future with her. The infatuation he had in high school was nothing compared to this. This was the real deal. Love in generous portions, like his mom's rhubarb pie. Of course, it didn't matter how he felt, considering she didn't feel the same way. After last night, he thought they had a chance, but apparently he was wrong. Her haughty stare reminded him that they were worlds apart. Life had played a cruel trick on him, giving him a taste of the forbidden. She was never his, and never would be. Clutching his cowboy hat in one hand, he staggered out of the diner and headed home. A few days later, Dax was reading the paper and casually turned to the obituaries. One in particular caught his eye. There, on the top row, was an obituary for Elizabeth Larkin, who had died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 86. Crazy. She was still very much alive the other day. Dax's immediate thought was to call Nellie. He rang her number, but she didn't answer. Of course she wouldn't. He hung up. Now was not the time to bother her. At the funeral, Dax came alone. He lined up at the viewing, where the sight of Nellie dressed starkly in an elegant black dress, her hair drawn up in an elegant chignon, and her face devoid of makeup, filled him with longing. Someone tapped his arm. It was Sylvia. "I hate funerals," she whispered. "Why?" "It reminds me that we're all going to die someday." He nodded in solemn agreement. "Oh." Sylvia's eyes flew to his face. "Sorry, that was insensitive of me. I can't even imagine losing both your parents." "It's okay. I miss them, but they're in a better place." The line moved. Dax was almost to Nellie. She glanced down, saw him, and ran into his arms. "It's okay," he said as she sobbed in his arms. "It's okay." He rubbed her back and kissed her hair. She took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped back. She noticed Sylvia, and an immediate change came over her. She stopped crying and smiled at both of them. "Thank you for coming." She averted her eyes and returned to her place in the line, distant once again.
Chapter 22. Nellie. After taking some time off for Graham's funeral, Nellie was back to work 2 days later. She was just minding her own business when Sylvia confronted her in the back. She folded her arms and blocked Nellie's way. "What's got your snoot out of joint?" Sylvia asked. Nellie frowned. "Pardon me? You've been a witch all day. You snapped at Corinne and the busboys. You've hardly smiled at the customers." She paused. "Now, I know you've had a tough time with your grandma's passing, and I'm sorry for that. But please, we need your 100%. Nellie could have gone on the defensive. Corinne was slow, and the customer was a jerk. And of course, there was that issue which must remain unspoken. Every time Nellie saw Sylvia, she burned with jealousy, reminded of the memory of her and Dax together at her Graham's funeral. Nellie took a deep breath and said, instead, "Sorry, I'll try to do better." Sylvia's expression softened, and she sighed. "Thank you. I know you've had a rough week." If only Sylvia knew. Nellie wanted to cry. Instead, she stiffened her spine and went to her next table. The afternoon went by in a blur, and Nellie made more of an effort to be nicer. The last thing she wanted to do was to be fired because she was moping for a cowboy. She secretly studied Sylvia. Grudgingly, she could see why Dax liked her. She had long black hair pulled back in a ponytail and a complexion as warm and pretty as cappuccino. She was small and petite, unlike Nellie, who was tall. Like how it was early in her life, Nellie once again felt insecure about her looks. She glanced in the mirror above the sink, hating her pale skin and unsubtle red hair. Even her green eyes, which usually drew compliments, annoyed her today. They looked like cat eyes, like a stray's hungry and pathetic. At closing time, Nellie was exhausted, physically and emotionally. She was relieved to finally toss her apron into the laundry bin. Nellie! Nellie turned to see Sylvia walking over to her. Sylvia jammed her hands in her jeans pockets. Sorry I bit your head off today. Nellie shrugged. It's okay. I deserved it. Especially since you put in a full day when you didn't need to. She paused. With Dad caring for Mom today, we really needed you. Thank you. You're welcome. How is she? Sylvia's eyes filled with tears. Not good. There's a treatment that could save her life, but it's experimental and the insurance company won't cover it. How much are we talking about? At least 50 grand. Wow, that's a lot of money. I know. Sylvia's shoulders slumped. I wish we could be earning more, but all the profits are already going to her treatment. Nellie thought for a minute. Have you thought of putting on a fundraiser? I wouldn't know how to do it. That sounds like a lot of work. There's nothing to it. Nellie waved a hand. You could put on a dinner, get a celebrity or two, and high-ticket auction items. Sylvia gaped at her. How do you know how to do this? I've watched my mom put on fundraisers enough times that I could do it in my sleep. Sylvia bit her lip and considered Nellie. Hey, I know this is kind of weird, and you can say no, but can you help me put on a fundraiser for my mom? Nellie studied her rival for Dax's affection. The old Nellie would have shut her down real quick. After all, if it weren't for Sylvia, she could have a clear shot at Dax. But Sylvia's mom had cancer, and she needed help. Don't be so petty, Nellie. I'll do it if I can decorate the venue, Nellie said, smiling. Sylvia grinned. You got it.
Chapter 23. Dax. Dax bent his head over his saddle project, intent on lining up two pieces together. He stitched them in place and looked it over with satisfaction. He glanced at his watch. 5 o'clock. Quitting time. He stretched his fingers and legs. Tomorrow he should be able to finish this saddle. He could call Nellie and tell her it was done. Nellie. The ache from her rejection at the diner still stung, but it did so less with each day that passed. Since the saddle was a gift for her dad, she might want to keep it a secret. She would have to come over and get it. Walking over to the window, he looked out, his gaze taking in his rural front landscape. Already the pasture was almost shin-high. He'd hardly noticed the change in what was growing out there. Since Nellie's last rejection, he'd focused on work, not doing much else. Someone knocked on the door, and immediately he thought of Nellie. Could she have had a change of heart? He glanced at his hands, covered with tanning oil and glue. He'd have to do. Opening his door, he was surprised to see Sylvia. Oh, hi. She smiled. Can I come in? Sure. He was glad to see his friend. Their relationship could have gone either way. In their case, nothing romantic came of it. He thought of her more as his younger sister. Sylvia remained standing. I can't stay long. I have to get some stuff for the diner, but I just wanted to ask you if you could help with something. Anything. I'm putting on a fundraiser for my mom, and I need a barn backdrop built, plus a few saddle props. You got it. I can certainly loan out saddles. She bit her lip. I hate to ask because it seems in poor taste, but would you be interested in donating one of your saddles for the silent auction? He rubbed his nape. Oh, Sylvia, I wish I could. I just sold a lady's saddle a day ago, and this one here, he pointed at Nellie's commission, has also been promised to a client. Her face fell. That's okay. I knew it would be a long shot anyway. Even if you had a saddle to donate, that's a lot to ask. I would have done it. I mean, what's a saddle compared to your mom's health? Her dark eyes filled with tears. You're a great friend, you know. I really appreciate you. She stepped forward and they hugged. Hey, I've been meaning to ask, she said as they pulled apart. How did that date with Nellie go? The mention of her name made his chest constrict. Good. Better than I expected. She's actually pretty nice when you get to know her. He stopped talking. It was too hard. I know what you mean. Sylvia walked over to the door. I was kind of peeved when my dad hired her for the diner, but she's turned out to be a great employee. I didn't expect her to last longer than a day, to be honest. It's now been a week, hasn't it? She nodded and then studied him. I thought maybe you and she were... Were what? That you liked each other. In the past, he did. Nah, it was nothing like that. We just had a couple of fun days was all. If you do like her, I was going to say that she's helping me a lot with the fundraiser, so I could kind of throw you together doing stuff. She gave him a meaningful glance. His heart raced at the prospect, but no, best to not go there. Yeah, he said, that would matter if we liked each other. Thanks again. I thought we could work on the set this Sunday after church if you have time. Sure. After Sylvia left, Dax leaned back against his workbench. He hadn't seen Nellie in a few days, hadn't even run into her at the grocery store. The thought of seeing her Sunday would have been delicious, except it had just opened a wound that had already begun healing. But he was a big boy, a cowboy, and cowboys didn't shy away from hard things. He was going to see Nellie this Sunday, even if it killed him.
Chapter 24. Nellie. Nellie got the box of paints out of her car and took them into the community hall. Sylvia had gotten permission to use the building for free for the fundraiser. They could have done it at the high school gym, but with all the summer activities and classes going on there right now, they wouldn't have been able to set up well ahead of time. It was a hot day. She was glad she wore shorts and put up her hair with a bandana. Over her tank top, she wore a blouse that she tied in a knot at her waist. For her shoes, she wore her rattiest sneakers. She was ready to paint. They were working on fake flowers cut out of wood by one of Sylvia's friends, and also a barn backdrop that someone was delivering today. She used her foot to nudge the door open and entered the building. Stopping short, she stared. There, on a trailer bed, helping other men move the barn backdrop, was Dax, front and center. Since seeing Dax at Graham's funeral, she tried to not think of him in the evenings when she was off. She had been too busy anyway during the day, but the nights were harder. She sometimes slept curled up with a pillow wet from her tears. She missed him, but she was resigned that they would never be together. Seeing him here in his sweaty shirt and cowboy hat, his muscles bulging from the effort, she felt a pang for what could have been. Nellie recognized the other men around. She and Bram Brown had dated, and she thought he still looked hot, but she was happy for him and Stella, his fiancée. His friend Joaquin was there, too. Joaquin was an Army soldier done with boot camp and staying in Sunny Ridge for the time being while waiting to be deployed. Finding an open spot on the stage, Nellie set her box of paints and set off to talk to Sylvia. Sylvia was looking at the design for the set, marking it with little swaths of color. Tammy, Bram's brunette sister, and Stella, his blonde fiancée, stood by her. Addie, a friend of theirs, played with her braids while looking over Sylvia's shoulder. Stella flashed Nellie a sweet smile. Nellie wished she could be as angelic as Stella. It was no wonder Bram had fallen head over heels for her. She was about as martyr-like as one could be, smiling at someone like Nellie, who just last Christmas tried to steal Bram back. But that was all water under the bridge. "Hi, Nellie," Sylvia greeted her. "Hi." Tammy flicked a haughty glance at Nellie. She and Tammy were similar in that they were both sassy and feisty, and Tammy was pretty protective of her family. She still acted suspicious around Nellie, probably worried that she was going to try to make a move on her brother. No thanks, Nellie was done with men for the time being. The girls chatted about the plans and its possibilities. As they were wrapping up, Nellie heard Dax's voice coming their way. "Got her up for you, Sylvia," Dax said. Nellie's throat tightened. She didn't think his voice would affect her as much as it did at that moment. It was a good thing she wasn't turned toward him, or she'd have made a fool of herself, surely. She pretended to be absorbed in the set plans, even though she had been ready to get on with other tasks. As she kept her gaze focused on the paper, she sensed Dax moving to stand behind her to the left. "What's that?" he asked. His voice was soft and uncertain, like he meant the words only for her. But Tammy spoke up. "Only the set of the century." Dax chuckled and then fell silent, probably looking at the details. Nellie turned to make her escape, but found herself hemmed in by Dax's bulk. Their gazes met, flaring like two stones stuck together. His blue eyes roamed her face, maybe to see how she was faring without him, which was perfectly fine, thank you. "Ready to paint by numbers?" he asked. Nellie's cheeks burned. She glanced back at the sheet with the little patches of color indicating how they should be painted. "It's about time you guys got that barn over here," she retorted. "We've been cooling our heels for a half hour." "Oh," Dax's eyes danced. "We had to change out of our church suits before coming over. It's good to know that you could change out of your yellow dress in record time." "My yellow dress? Oh." He'd noticed? She had been in church earlier that day, sitting up front with her family. She had turned once and had seen him, bareheaded in his suit, looking straight at her. For the rest of the service, she remained facing forward. The little hat was cute, too. That was that. He moved away, probably patting himself on the back for poking fun at her painting abilities and choice of outfits. She veered the opposite way, bent on steering clear of him. But all afternoon, it seemed he wasn't going to leave her alone. He came over to look at the flowers she was painting, pointing out spots she'd missed, opened a paint can she was having trouble with, and just little things that only served to annoy and discombobulate her. With the flowers done, everyone started painting the barn in earnest. There were some harder-to-paint spots that required using a ladder. Tammy was busy talking on the phone with someone, and Stella was busy taping the trim. So Nellie marched on up and took a paintbrush dipped in red paint to finish the peak of the gable. She slathered on the paint, did a couple more swabs on it, and declared it good. She started to climb down the ladder when Dax said, "Careful, that step is wobbly." Nellie was so startled she missed the rung altogether and fell backward, right into Dax's arms. Her heart raced with excitement from the fall and the thrill at being held by Dax. His glance lingered on her mouth, drawing her gaze to his. "Careful," he said, setting her down. "Sounds like that ladder ought to be replaced," she said tartly. "Yes, ma'am." His eyes gleamed. "I've got another one at home," Bram offered. "Better get it over here," Dax said. Nellie set the paintbrush across the mouth of the can, kicking herself for reacting to Dax as she did. He had reduced her to an ungrateful harpy, but she couldn't get herself to thank him, considering he'd been lobbing barbs at her all day. Tammy came squealing into the conversation. "You'll never guess what happened, guys, but Jeremy Hawk called me." "Wow, he did," Stella said. "Did he ask you out?" Tammy rolled her eyes. "I wish. Unfortunately, I'm a little out of the league of country superstars." "Sylvia, are you listening?" Sylvia looked up from her clipboard. "What was that?" "Jeremy will be glad to perform at your fundraiser." Sylvia's jaw dropped. "That's wonderful." "I know, right?" Tammy floated away. "He said to pick 2 songs. She and Sylvia twittered about this new development. Nellie smiled. Tammy's infatuation for Jeremy was legendary. And hopeless. Like Nellie's infatuation for Dax. Hopeless, that is. Sylvia stopped talking to Tammy and admired the set. "Oh, you guys, this is amazing." Joaquin stood behind her, and Nellie noted what a good-looking couple they were. Sylvia was one lucky girl to have both him and Dax around. Maybe they were even fighting over her. Nellie got some paper towels to wipe her paint-covered fingers. She wished she could wipe off the past with a certain cowboy as easily. "Sorry, Sylvia," Nellie said. "I gotta go. My family has a dinner planned. I'll get with you Wednesday and work on the centerpieces." "Sure thing," Sylvia said, coming over to hug her. "Thanks so much." "You're welcome, sweetie," Nellie said, hugging her back and marveling that her one-time enemy was now her friend. "See you guys." She waved vaguely in the direction of the others. She didn't want to give the impression she was saying bye to Dax in particular. "I'll walk out there with you," Dax said. Nellie didn't say anything. She just turned at her heels and walked out of the community hall. Hey, wait up," Dax called out. Nellie waited, but didn't turn. "Your dad's saddle is done. I wondered if you wanted me to deliver it." "Oh, no," she said, whirling around to face him. "It's a secret." "That's what I thought. You can come up to my place to pick it up. That is, if you don't mind." He rubbed his chiseled jaw. "And maybe if you'd like, I can fix you dinner." "What would Sylvia think of that?" she blurted out. "Sylvia?" He frowned. "We should be done with the set by then and everything else, so I don't see why she should care." It was only an invitation for dinner, but Nellie wondered what kind of heartless cowboy this was, feeding Nellie dinner while obviously doing Sylvia's bidding. I can't have dinner," she said, "but I'll stop by for the saddle tomorrow night." Disappointment flared in his eyes. At least she must have just imagined it. Then he broke into an easy smile. "No worries. I'll be home."
Chapter 25. Dax. Dax was shaping a piece of leather when he heard the knock. He opened the door to find Nellie standing at his workshop's front porch. Bub lay by the mat, ready to do nothing at a moment's notice. Oh, but Nellie was lovely. Her skin glowed with summer, and her hair had been brushed down, curling around her shoulders. She was wearing a light blue shirt dress that made him think of a cloudless sky, the fabric clinging lightly to her curves. He stuffed his hands in his pockets, his throat constricted with yearning. "Come in," he said. She stepped over Bub and walked in, her little white purse slung over her shoulder. When she was at the diner, he thought of her as an equal, but days like today, dressed as she was in her rich girl clothes, he felt so out of her league. "No work today?" he asked. "I got off earlier," she said, looking around at the saddles in various stages of completion. "They put me on an earlier shift." She walked around, tracing her fingers over the leathers he had set out. He caught a whiff of her perfume, something light and citrusy. "The saddle's over there," he said. Dax had set it on a saddle rack in a corner, away from his active workstations. He felt a surge of pride over it, probably one of his best saddles. Even at 10 grand, he thought it was a steal. Most saddles of that workmanship, if sold elsewhere, could cost the buyer double that amount at least. Nellie approached it, her mouth agape. "Dax Ellison, this is amazing." Dax felt a frisson of warmth over her compliment. She said, "I don't buy a lot of Western saddles, as you know, but Daddy has enough lying around that I can tell this is some fine craftsmanship." "Thanks. I worked hard to give it some personality." She leaned closer to inspect it. "Did you emboss the decorations on it?" "Yes'm." "That leather is pretty." He glanced at the golden sheen on the seat. "It's my favorite." Her eyes glistened. "Daddy's gonna be over the moon." "He'd better be." She smiled, scrunching her nose. "You are full of yourself, Dax Ellison." But she said it teasingly, and with that little sassy smile that made his pulse skip. She blinked and then poked around in her bag. "I've got the full amount here, in cash." "Cash? Why, Nellie, someone could have mugged you on your way over." She rolled her eyes. "Me and the 2 cows I saw along the way." She handed him the thick wad. Her cheeks turned pink. You can count it. I won't be offended. He shook his head. It's okay. I trust you. Let me get the saddle for you. I would appreciate that. Thanks. She moved to the door. They both stepped over Bub, with Dax following her to her car and loading the saddle in the trunk. When he turned to her, she was staring at his arms. She quickly averted her eyes. Where are you going to store it in your house? He asked, desperate to keep her talking for a little longer. I'll probably keep it in my trunk, she said, her forehead crinkling. Is that okay? As long as you don't leave it there through extremes in temperature, it should be okay. It's just a couple of days. Yeah, that should be fine then. She smiled, her eyes shining. I can't wait for my daddy to see it. You'll have to tell me how that goes, he said. A look passed between them, as though to say there would not be a future conversation. This was it. There was no reason for him to keep her, unless... Nellie, he said. Her eyes came alive. If you guys ever need more saddles, I'm your man. Nellie's expression dimmed as she clutched tighter at her purse. Sure thing. See you at the fundraiser. After she drove away in that sweet pink Mustang, Dax could have kicked himself. Selling her saddles, are you, Dax? You just want her for her money, huh? He groaned into his hands and went back to his workshop.
Chapter 26. Nellie. The next evening, Nellie smoothed her full skirt and gazed at her reflection in the mirror. The green of the gauzy overlayer matched her eyes, enhancing their rich color further. She twirled and vamped it up like a little girl playing dress-up. Although she had surprisingly enjoyed working at the diner, she was glad to change into nice girly clothes for the fundraiser. She walked out of her room calling out, Mom, Daddy, see you at the fundraiser. Don't be late. We're leaving soon, Mom said. Nellie drove her Mustang over to the community hall and had to park about 6 rows over from the front door. That was good. It meant there were plenty of people here tonight. She tingled with excitement. She especially looked forward to the silent auction. The night's auctioneer, Miles Graves, would do a good job creating interest in even the cheapest things. Across the room, she saw Dax talking to Sylvia. Sylvia looked pretty in the sapphire blue dress that flattered her petite frame. As for Dax, as he did at church, he wore a suit tonight. His jacket emphasized his broad shoulders and buff build. She really should stop staring at him, or he'd catch her gawking. Too late. He glanced her way and then did a double take. Her heart pounded as he said something to Sylvia and then crossed the room to end up by her. Wow, he said, looking her dress up and down. You look amazing. She felt a blush come on. Thanks. You look great too. I clean up nice, don't I? He said. And then some. You did a great job with the decorations, he said. Nellie gazed around at the barn motif and the centerpieces they'd made out of fresh-cut sunflowers in mason jars. Thanks. I'm glad they turned out well. Are your folks coming? Dax asked. Yes, they're right behind me. His voice lowered. There are 3 seats at my table if you'd like to join me. She hesitated, but figured her parents were going to be there anyway as a buffer for any awkwardness. Okay, that'll be great. Really? Dax looked as if he'd just won the jackpot. Odd. Was Sylvia just too busy for him tonight that he needed a proxy? Jeremy Hawk's band was already set up and ready to play, just trying a few chords here and there for mic check. Eyeing his handsome face and athletic build, Nellie could see why Tammy was in love with him. Dax led Nellie over to his table, where they would be seated by the mayor and his city council members. Nellie looked around. Does Sylvia need help? I think everything is pretty much set. The local FFA is helping serve. You can sit back and relax. Like she'd intended, until Dax invited her to his table. How's work going? He asked. Great. I'm at a crossroads right now. I have to decide if I keep working past Wednesday. What's Wednesday? Her glance slid toward him and away. The 2-week mark for me to stay in a job. And will you quit now? She fiddled with her napkin. I actually enjoy working there. It's funny. I would never have expected that. It gets me seeing everyone in town and I meet new people. I'm thinking of opening my own party planning business, maybe for weddings and such. Dax's eyes glimmered. What about back east? You've convinced me. I want to stay close to family, so he covered her hand with his. I bet whatever you choose to do, you'll do great. Thanks for the encouragement. You gave me the wake-up call I needed. Anytime, he murmured. Her gaze flicked to their touching hands, sparks shooting from her fingertips. This is nice, Daddy said as he joined them. Dax lifted his hand in a jiffy, and Nellie leaned away from him. She realized Daddy meant the way the place was decorated. Daddy pinned Dax with his gaze. Where have you been, young man? You left our daughter pining away for you. Pining for me? Dax shot a confused glance at her. Nellie wished the floor would swallow her up. Fortunately, Sylvia chose to kick off the evening at that moment. Welcome, everyone, Sylvia said, her dress sparkling under the lights. It's so good to see you all. On behalf of my family, and especially my mother, she pointed to a beautiful but frail-looking lady at one of the front tables. Thank you. She went on to name the sponsors. Afterward, her eyes swept across the room, stopping at Dax's table. I have some people to thank, my friends Dax, Bram, Stella, Tammy, and Nellie, for working super hard to make this a wonderful event. People clapped. Dax touched the small of Nellie's back. Good job. She gave him a sidelong glance. He was looking at her like the day when they faked being together. Of course, he could simply be happy for Sylvia. Sylvia thanked a few more people and then announced that dinner was served. A familiar aroma filled the air. No way, Nellie said. Your ribs? Yep. A whole side of beef's worth. I can't wait. The ribs were as good as she remembered them, and the sides were wonderful thanks to Sylvia's wizardry. Dax and Daddy talked about property and cattle while Nellie watched the two men she loved, although only one of them returned her affection. During dinner, Jeremy and his band entertained the crowd. Nellie looked around for Tammy and spotted her, digging Jeremy's music as only a besotted fan could. Nellie couldn't see Joaquin. You know where Joaquin is? She asked Dax. He had some work training thing out of town. Too bad, huh? Yeah. And now, Sylvia said, I'm going to turn over the time to our auctioneer, Miles Graves. Take it away, Miles. Miles warmed the crowd quickly. Soon they were laughing and rolling in the aisles. One couldn't have expected that of someone like him, hardly smiling, his mouth covered by a sandy, longish handlebar mustache. Dax glanced at Nellie. Do you know anything about the silent auction grand item? Sylvia's been very hush-hush about it. No, Nellie said. Oh, would you look at that cool auction basket? Dax cocked his head, craning his neck to look. Miles jumped back on stage. And now for the moment we've all been waiting for, the grand prize auction item. I will need the help of our beautiful event organizer, Sylvia Garcia. Drum roll, please. Sylvia's gaze met Nellie's. They both smiled. Nellie's stomach was all aflutter. We'd like to have the grand prize wheeled up, please, Sylvia said. Two teens came out, pushing something covered with a sheet. We'd like to thank our donor, who has asked to remain anonymous. Dax leaned toward Nellie's ear, making her shiver. You know who that is? She gave him a coy smile. Maybe. Sylvia took to the mic again. Can I please have a countdown? 10, 9, 8. The audience counted all the way to 1, upon which Sylvia pulled off the sheet. But Nellie wasn't watching Sylvia. Her eyes were on Dax. His eyes widened in recognition of the beautiful embossed saddle. Then he trained his gaze squarely on Nellie.
Chapter 27. Dax. Dax couldn't believe his eyes. Nellie put her finger on his lips and shook her head. Her touch nearly made him come undone. To sit by her and to not touch her, especially with this grand gesture. He stared, really stared at her. Who was this girl? He had been so wrong about her from the very start. This confirmed his belief that she was amazing. "This saddle was made by our very own Sunny Ridge saddle craftsman, Dax Ellison. Dax, stand up, dude!" The audience laughed. Dax obliged, even though he could tell his ears were turning red from the unnecessary attention. As they started the bidding, Dax leaned close to Nellie. "Why?" "Why what?" she whispered back, blinking innocently. "I thought that was for you-know-whose birthday." "It was," Nellie said. "And then I had this idea that it was better off helping the Garcia family." Dax stared at her. "That's 10 grand, he whispered. "I know. I hope it will get double or triple." "I hope so too." "It will. I can feel it. I don't know of anyone who makes a more beautiful and beloved saddle than you." Her eyes were shining. Speaking of beautiful and beloved. Suddenly, their little conversation was interrupted by loud applause. No one had won yet, but it appeared some fierce bidding was going on between the mayor at their table and Nellie's daddy. "40 cannot get 40, Miles was announcing. Dax and Nellie gasped in shock. "Was that 40,000? Dax asked. Nellie turned to her parents. Her mom smiled calmly. Nellie turned back to Dax. "Heavens, I think so." Bidding stalled at 40. Dax watched the two bidders at the table. The mayor looked a bit flummoxed. Leroy Larkin gestured 5 and 0. Dax gulped. He didn't expect this much interest in his saddle. Now it was in the mayor's corner. The mayor shook his head, looking like he had indigestion. Miles announced, "Going once, going twice, sold to Leroy Larkin for 50,000. The entire room erupted in shouts and applause. Sylvia knelt by her mother and hugged her. Nellie's arms went around Dax, and he held her like he never wanted to let her go. But of course, eventually they had to come apart. Nellie embraced her dad and wished him, "Happy birthday, Daddy." While she was busy doing that, Dax sought out Sylvia. He waited his turn as well-wishers came up to her and her mother. Finally, he got to step up and hug her. "I'm so happy for you," he said. "Thank you," Sylvia pursed her lips. "You know who you should be thanking for this, of course." Dax looked to his left and noticed that Nellie had come up to them and was watching with a hurt expression. She did an about-face and ran out the door. "I think you'd better chase after her," Sylvia said. He didn't need more prodding. However, between the crowded room and Nellie being too quick with her Mustang, by the time he came out to the parking lot, he couldn't catch up with her. He came back in, confused as to why she seemed so angry. "Did you find her?" Sylvia asked. "No." He rubbed his nape. "I'm really confused." Sylvia sighed. "Mi amigo, it's simple. She's in love with you." "What?" He gaped at Sylvia. "And she's jealous of me." "Of you?" Sylvia nodded. "I finally put 2 and 2 together. I had my suspicions, but I realized she was in love with you when she delivered the saddle. When she talked about how you worked on the saddle, it was in the voice of a woman in love with the saddle maker." "But I don't understand why she was jealous of you." "Because you and I seem close, and maybe even because you like to give me friendly hugs." It was as though a big honking neon sign lit up in front of Dax. Her crushed expression in the diner after the 4th, in line at the funeral, her questions about Sylvia caring, and just moments ago. He put his palm to his face. I think I see everything now." Sylvia touched his sleeve. "She's a keeper, mi amigo." "You don't need to tell me," Dax groaned. "I know." "Admittedly, I didn't think you and her would be a good fit. Knowing her heart, though, I've decided you two are. And I even kind of like her now, and not just as an employee." She smiled. I thought she was just a spoiled rich girl. She had us all fooled, didn't she?" "I was the biggest fool," Dax murmured. "Not only that, she could have been mean to you, but she took the high road." Sylvia arched her eyebrow. "And what are you going to do about it?" Dax backed away to head out the door. Win her back.
Chapter 28. Nellie. Nellie pulled into the diner parking lot the next day, her heart heavy, like waterlogged boots. She took her shades off and put them in her glove compartment. She didn't really feel like going to work, especially since she would see Sylvia. The thought of Corinne being super slow on the orders already had Nellie riled. Ugh. She got out of the car and made her way through the 2 diner doors into the back. Sylvia looked up from the books and flashed her a smile. "Hi." "Hi." Nellie made a weak attempt at a return smile. "Sorry I ran out on you last night. I wondered where you disappeared to. I wanted to tell you thank you." "You're welcome. Do you know how much you raised?" "Almost 70,000. Despite Nellie's jealousy, she was happy for her friend. "That's great." "Thanks to you." Nellie shrugged. "It was really Dax's saddle. Daddy made it all worth it." Sylvia grinned and then looked over Nellie's shoulder. "Looks like you have a customer at table 3. "Okay." Nellie tied her apron around her waist and picked up a menu. She was halfway to the table when she looked up and saw who it was. She walked the rest of the way to Dax Ellison with measured steps, trying to stay calm, even though her throat closed up and her heart hammered in her chest. Was she always going to feel this way around him? "Good morning," he said, his blue eyes bluer than ever. "It's actually almost noon," she retorted. His mouth twitched. "You ran out on me last night. You were busy." "I'm never too busy for you." Tears blurred her vision of her notebook. "What'll you have to drink?" "I just want to order." She glanced into his eyes, focused on her, and then at her notebook. "Okay, what would you like?" "I want the beautiful lady server named Nellie Larkin." She frowned. Very funny. He set down the menu and gazed at her intently. "I'm serious." She bit her lip. "What'll you have for the sides?" "Love, kisses, and forgiveness for a foolish saddle maker." She stuffed her notebook in her apron pocket. "Listen, I'm not in the mood for jokes." "Me neither." He stood and scooped her off her feet. "That's why I'm taking you outside." "Dax Ellison," she said, scandalized. "You put me down right now." "Not until you listen to me." She craned her neck around. "Help! Sylvia!" Sylvia poked her head through the kitchen doorway. "Looks like he doesn't need any help," she said with a grin. Why was Sylvia taking this all so calmly? Why was Dax acting like a caveman? Dax carried Nellie out the 2 doors and all the way to his truck, where he set her feet on the ground. He lowered the tailgate and gestured for her to sit. Bub, the basset hound, raised his eyes but didn't budge from his sprawled position on the truck bed. She sat as far away as possible from the dog and his owner. "I've been stupid," Dax said. She remained stony-faced. "I didn't realize I'd been hurting someone," he added softly. "Namely you." "Did you think I liked Sylvia?" She swallowed painfully. "Don't you?" "I don't." She couldn't believe her ears. "But the day after the 4th, you were hugging her. You and she looked like you were talking seriously about something." For a moment, he was lost in thought. "Oh, that. She told me her mother was doing poorly, so I comforted her." She gave him a skeptical glance. He traced a cross over his heart with his finger. "We're just friends, I swear," Nellie murmured. "And then last night, when you hugged her, all in the name of friendship, I was so dense I didn't even realize how it would come across to the woman I love." "The woman you love?" Her voice came out with wonder. He nodded and took a step toward her. And another. "So you were jealous?" he asked softly. "Spiteful, angry, hurt, pathetic, depressed?" "Yes." "Hallelujah!" "Dax," she scolded, "really now? I was miserable, if you must know." "I'm sorry," He touched her cheek, making her breath catch. Believe me, I was miserable too. I had no idea that you cared about me, and yet I cared about you so much. She smoothed her apron. At first, I didn't want to admit that I liked you. Pride, I guess. And then when you seemed sweet on Sylvia, I kept my distance. And here I was, thinking you didn't want to have anything to do with me. Dax shoved his hands in his pockets and gave her a hopeful smile. She read the hurt, uncertainty, and wonder in his voice. You mean we both botched it up? She said, giggling. Sounds like it. For the longest time, I swear you hated my guts. You were always teasing and berating me like I was the last girl in the world you would like. He took her hands in his. I know, it's been a long time, but I'd never recovered from that Valentine's dance in high school. When I picked the football captain over you, she squeezed his hands. I'm sorry. That was terrible of me. I owned the poor decision. But my girlfriends at that time talked me into it. And at the end, he wasn't worth breaking your heart over. She lowered her hands and smiled. I tried to look for you at the dance to apologize. You did? She nodded. I didn't go, he said. Can you blame me? She shook her head and caressed his scruff. But you forgive me now. He nodded. When we went on that fake date, I realized I was wrong about you. You can still be a spoiled cowgirl sometimes. Hey, a sweet, sometimes sassy, kind, generous cowgirl. When you took that job, when I saw how sweet you were with your gram, and when you donated the saddle, I fell in love with you even deeper. She said, beaming. Tell me more. If you're fishing for compliments, Miss Larkin, you should go to the reservoir. She stuck her tongue out at him. I love you. He squeezed her hands. She squeezed back. I love you too. He closed the space between them, his arms circling her. She savored the smell of sweet hay on his shirt. We have a lot of time to make up for, don't we? He murmured. How will we do that? She asked, her breath catching as he pulled her even closer. How about... His heated gaze dropped to her lips. A kiss. Here? She whispered back. In the parking lot? With everyone from the diner watching? With Bub as our witness. She giggled and then sobered. I think Grandma's happily watching us from heaven right now. No doubt. She leaned her cheek against his. We owe her us. He nodded and gave her a hug. When she pulled back, he grasped her jaw lightly. Exquisite moments later, his lips touched hers, and she melted into him, all her pent-up longing, desires, and dreams pouring into their kiss. As they broke apart and caught their breath, she asked, But who will I spar with now? Me. Who else? He nuzzled her neck. Don't worry. We can always kiss and make up. Good idea. His fingers twined in her hair as he pulled her into another kiss, until their hearts were going, gone. The end. This has been a Cowboy for Auction, Riverdale Ranch Romance Book Number 2, written by Jewel Allen, narrated by Melissa Connell and Scott Rose. Copyright 2019 by Jewel Allen.